In the year 1347, a scribe was executed for the crime of reading, not writing, not speaking, simply reading words that already existed. His name has been lost to history, but the record of his death remains, buried in the margins of a French monastery's ledger. The entry is brief. It notes the method of execution, the date, and a single phrase that translates roughly to "for knowledge of forbidden text." No trial is mentioned, no defense. Just a man who saw something he shouldn't have and paid for it with his life. What was on that parchment that was worth a man's life? The candle in that scribe's chamber had flickered over words that were never meant to leave the stone walls of the castle archive. He had been copying legal documents, as scribes did, transferring aging manuscripts onto fresh parchment before the ink faded into illegibility. Somewhere in that routine work, he encountered something else. A law that existed but could not be spoken. A rule that governed the lives of thousands, yet those thousands were never permitted to know it existed. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across medieval Europe, from the foggy courts of England to the sunlit plazas of Italy, parallel legal systems operated in shadow. History classes taught us about Magna Carta, about the grand pronouncements of kings, and the theatrical justice of public trials. What they didn't teach us was that beneath every public law, there existed another layer. An invisible architecture of rules that truly controlled medieval life. These weren't lost laws, forgotten through the chaos of time and war. They were intentionally concealed. Locked in monastery vaults, hidden in castle chambers, memorized by judges who would never write them down. Some were kept secret because they were so advantageous to the powerful that revealing them would have caused immediate revolt. Others were hidden because they contradicted the very principles those same authorities proclaimed in town squares. Consider this. There were laws that allowed certain nobles to commit acts that would see a peasant hanged. Not through corruption or abuse of power, but through actual written statute that gave explicit permission. These weren't exceptions or loopholes. They were deliberate legal frameworks, carefully constructed and rigorously enforced, that simply could not be made public. There were regulations that made poverty itself a punishable offense in certain jurisdictions, creating legal traps that ensnared those who had nothing and gave them even less. There were church statutes that granted powers so sweeping, so invasive into private life, that even the most devout believers of that era would have questioned their faith had they known the full extent. The medieval world we imagine, knights and ladies, castles and cathedrals, was real, but it was only the surface. Beneath it ran a circulatory system of hidden law that determined who could travel, who could marry, who could speak, even who could learn to read. And the people living under these laws often had no idea why their lives took the shapes they did. They felt the pressure of invisible walls, but couldn't see what held them in place. This creates an unsettling question. How do you obey laws you don't know exist? How do you avoid punishment for violating rules that have never been explained to you? The answer is both simple and chilling. You can't. And perhaps that was precisely the point. Medieval rulers understood something that modern people often forget. The most effective control isn't fear of known punishment. It's uncertainty about what might be forbidden. When you don't know where the boundaries are, you stay far from where you think they might be. You censor yourself more thoroughly than any authority could censor you. But why? What were they so desperate to hide? And more importantly, why does any of this matter now, centuries after those parchments turned to dust? The answer begins with understanding that secret laws weren't just medieval aberrations. They were power's preferred tool, and that tool never really went away. Medieval lords had a legal right that, if discovered by peasants, would have caused immediate revolution. It was written in official documents, enforced by judges, and completely hidden from 99% of the population. That law remained secret for over 400 years. And it wasn't alone. The chaos of medieval secret law wasn't actually chaos at all. When scholars finally gained access to the sealed archives, monastery vaults opened during the Reformation, castle records unearthed during renovations, encrypted ledgers decoded centuries after their authors died, a pattern emerged. The hidden laws fell into 3 distinct categories, each concealed for its own calculated reason. The first category: laws of privilege. These were statutes that explicitly granted the ruling class rights so outrageous that public knowledge would have meant immediate uprising. In certain regions of France during the 14th century, local lords possessed the legal authority to requisition food from peasant stores during famine. Not borrow, not purchase, take. The public justification involved vague language about communal responsibility, a noble obligation to maintain order. The private legal text was blunt. The lord could take what he needed, when he needed it, and the peasant had no legal recourse. If your family starved because the lord's household required your winter grain, that was lawful seizure, not theft. Then there was the right that historians spent centuries trying to prove never existed, partly because the idea seemed too horrific to be true. In parts of medieval Scotland and northern France, certain nobles held a legally documented right to the first night with newlywed brides from peasant families. The practice had a Latin name that appeared in private legal codes. It had procedures. It had exemption clauses for those who could pay a fee. It was law, written and enforceable, and it was never proclaimed in any public square. The second category: laws of control. These were regulations designed not to govern behavior, but to prevent social mobility entirely. In England during the late 13th century, peasants in certain manors were legally required to seek permission before learning to read. The request would be reviewed. It would almost always be denied. The justification, when justification was given at all, involved concerns about peasants neglecting their labor. The actual purpose was simpler. Literacy meant access to law itself, and access to law meant the ability to challenge authority. Clothing regulations existed across medieval Europe, dictating which collars and fabrics each social class could wear. Some of these were public, sumptuary laws announced with great ceremony. But accompanying those public restrictions were private codes that went much further. A 14th century German statute, discovered only in the 20th century, made it illegal for anyone born into the peasant class to wear any shade of blue, regardless of their wealth. The color itself was reserved for nobility. Violation could result in confiscation of property. The law existed for 90 years before it was quietly repealed, and there's no evidence it was ever publicly announced. Perhaps most disturbing was the third category: laws of survival. These were legal frameworks for practices authorities publicly condemned, but privately systematized. Church officials in multiple cities managed prostitution through secret regulatory schemes, collecting fees and maintaining records while preaching chastity from pulpits. During plague outbreaks, certain jurisdictions had written guidelines for which villages could be sealed off and left to die. Essentially, lists prioritizing which communities were expendable. These documents existed. They were consulted. They were never meant to be found. This wasn't scattered corruption or occasional abuse of power. It was systematized double law, the version proclaimed in the town squares and the version locked in vaults. England had it. France had it. The Holy Roman Empire had it. The architecture was everywhere, and it was built to last. But architecture requires maintenance. Secret laws need mechanisms to stay secret. So how did they do it? How do you enforce rules that can't be spoken? A medieval judge could sentence you to death, look you in the eyes, and never tell you which law you'd broken. The law existed. Your crime was real, but the rule itself was invisible. How is that even possible? The answer lies in something medieval authorities perfected: the machinery of secrecy. These weren't just hidden laws. They were laws designed to stay hidden while still functioning, still shaping behavior, still destroying lives when necessary. That required engineering. The first mechanism was selective enforcement. Secret laws were never applied consistently. A merchant might transport grain across a regional boundary dozens of times without incident. Then, on the 41st crossing, be arrested and stripped of his goods. To observers, it looked arbitrary. Bad luck. Perhaps the merchant had offended someone powerful. What they couldn't see was the underlying statute that made every crossing illegal. A law applied only when convenient, only when someone needed to be controlled or punished for reasons having nothing to do with grain. This inconsistency was the point. Consistent enforcement would have revealed the pattern. People would have learned the rule through observation, through warning each other, through collective experience. But when punishment seemed random, no pattern emerged. Fear spread without understanding. You couldn't avoid violating a law you didn't know existed, but you could be destroyed by it at any moment. That ambient dread was more effective than any public prohibition. The second mechanism was human. There existed a class of officials, judges, senior clerks, certain monastery administrators, who memorized secret statutes. These legal interpreters could invoke laws without reference to any written document. In court, they would simply announce that a particular act violated established law, offer no further explanation, and proceed to sentencing. Their authority appeared mystical, almost divine. Only they knew the full legal architecture, and that knowledge made them indispensable to power. A record from 13th century England describes a travelling judge who presided over cases in 12 different villages, applying different secret statutes in each location, depending on local arrangements with lords and church officials. He carried no documents. Everything existed in his memory. When he died, much of that legal knowledge died with him, until his successor was privately trained. This oral preservation created an unbroken chain of secret law, passed from one keeper to the next, never written where common eyes might find it. Then there were physical solutions. Castle courts operated in windowless chambers, often underground. Trials could be conducted, sentences passed, and punishments ordered without public observation. The accused would enter, the doors would close, and when they opened again, justice had been decided. By the time anyone learned what happened, the convicted had already been transferred elsewhere or executed. Documents existed, but they were protected through layers of inaccessibility. Some were written in obsolete dialects of Latin that even educated clergy struggled to read. Others used code phrases that meant nothing without prior knowledge of the system. Archives were physically separated from communities, stored in monastery towers, castle vaults, or remote church holdings. A peasant couldn't simply walk in and request to see the laws governing his life. The idea itself would have been incomprehensible. These archives are still being discovered. In 1998, renovations of a French monastery revealed a sealed chamber containing 14th century legal documents that hadn't been seen in 600 years. In 2007, a German castle's foundation collapse exposed a hidden vault with coded manuscripts that took specialists 3 years to fully decrypt. But perhaps the most elegant mechanism was plausible enforcement. Secret laws were often crafted to align just closely enough with public morality that punishments seemed justified even without explanation. When someone was executed for heresy, the actual legal statute might be far more specific and expansive than anyone knew. But the general concept of punishing heresy was publicly acceptable. The secret law hid inside the shadow of public belief. There's a record, fragmentary but verified, of a 14th century French peasant who somehow discovered a legal text. He spent 3 years trying to understand why his discovery terrified local officials. Then he disappeared from all historical records. His name remains. His fate does not. So why go through all this trouble? Why not just rule by force alone? Medieval rulers discovered that the most obedient citizens weren't those who feared punishment. They were those who feared they might already be criminals without knowing it. Imagine living every day uncertain whether your normal activities were capital offenses. This wasn't accidental. It was psychological warfare, carefully constructed and ruthlessly maintained. Medieval authorities understood something that wouldn't be formally studied until centuries later. Uncertainty paralyzes more effectively than threat. When laws are public and clear, the human mind adapts. You calculate risk. You learn the boundaries. You know exactly what to avoid and what remains safe. You can even organize with others who face the same restrictions, building collective strategies for resistance or circumvention. But when the boundaries are hidden, everything changes. Every action becomes potentially dangerous. Every decision carries unknowable risk. You can't calculate what you can't see, and you can't avoid what you don't know exists. The result is total self-censorship, far more comprehensive than any enforced code could achieve. In the market towns of 1290s England, merchants operated under partially secret commerce regulations. They knew the public rules, standard weights and measures, declared tax rates, official market hours. But accompanying those public rules were private statutes that expanded or contradicted them in ways merchants could only guess at. A trader might sell wool at the publicly stated price, following every announced regulation, and still face prosecution for violations he couldn't have known existed. Letters from this period survive, written by merchants to family members or trusted associates. The anxiety is palpable even across 7 centuries. One wool trader describes weighing every decision multiple times, conducting business that should have been routine with constant dread. He writes of merchants who simply stopped trading certain goods, not because they knew those goods were restricted, but because they couldn't be certain they weren't. Better to lose profit than risk ruin. This is what psychologists would later call learned helplessness, the state that emerges when punishment seems arbitrary and avoidance seems impossible. Medieval legal systems didn't just punish specific behaviors. They created environments where people punished themselves through perpetual anxiety and excessive caution. Consider a day in the life of a medieval craftsman. Not hypothetical fantasy, but reconstructed from court records and personal accounts. He wakes in his workshop, which might violate undisclosed zoning regulations depending on which secret statute applies to his street. He prepares to travel to market. But traveling itself requires documentation he may or may not possess, depending on laws he may or may not be subject to. At market, he sells his goods at prices that seem fair, but secret price controls might make his transaction illegal. He speaks with other craftsmen, but certain topics of conversation, complaints about authorities, questions about laws, even discussion of economic conditions, might constitute sedition under statutes he's never seen. Every interaction, every transaction, every word carries potential legal danger he cannot assess. By day's end, he has likely violated multiple secret laws without knowing it. He's simultaneously a law-abiding craftsman and a technical criminal. And that dual status is exactly what makes him controllable. Some secret laws were deliberately designed to be contradictory. A merchant might be legally required to report certain transactions, but legally prohibited from keeping the records that would allow accurate reporting. A traveler might be required to possess documentation that was illegal for him to obtain. These weren't drafting errors. They were traps that ensured universal guilt. When everyone is technically criminal, authority becomes absolute. Any person can be legitimately prosecuted at any time for any reason, because the legal justification always exists somewhere in the hidden code. The prosecution appears lawful. The conviction is technically valid. Only the accused knows that countless others commit the same violations daily without consequence. And he can't argue selective enforcement when he's not allowed to know the law exists at all. This created what we might call legal fog, a permanent state of uncertainty about what was permitted and what was forbidden. Fog doesn't just hide specific objects, it makes distance itself impossible to judge. You don't know if the danger is right in front of you or far away. So you move slowly, carefully. You stop taking chances. You stay in place. Medieval people lived in that fog. Some their entire lives. But did they know? Did they understand they were being controlled through invisible law? Or did they think their anxiety was simply the natural state of existence? And if they knew, did anyone fight back? Some medieval people knew the secret laws. They knew exactly which invisible lines could kill you. But knowing didn't make them powerful, it made them targets. Their knowledge was a death sentence waiting to happen. Secrecy was never absolute. In every jurisdiction with hidden laws, there existed a class of people who had to know. Lawyers who argued cases in closed courts, scribes who copied documents they couldn't discuss, low-level church officials who filed papers they couldn't read aloud, educated servants who witnessed proceedings they could never repeat. These informed few occupied a strange space in medieval society. They were privileged with knowledge but trapped by it. Speaking meant death. Silence meant complicity. The psychological weight of this position left traces in the historical record. In Florence during the 1340s, a notary named Giacomo di Benedetto kept a personal journal in an encryption system so complex it wasn't fully decoded until 1923. What emerged from those pages was the confession of a man torn apart by what he knew. He described secret statutes he'd encountered in his work. Laws permitting certain nobles to seize property without cause, regulations that made specific forms of worship illegal, while other forms were publicly encouraged, guidelines for imprisoning people who hadn't technically committed any public crime. But what haunts his entries isn't just the content of these laws. It's his awareness of his own complicity. He wrote of feeling like an accomplice to injustice, of knowing his professional work helped enforce rules that he found morally reprehensible, of being unable to warn those who would be destroyed by laws they couldn't see coming. His journal entries grow increasingly anguished. The final entry, dated 3 months before his death, is a single line. I am both clerk and prisoner. Others used their knowledge differently. Some became information brokers, whispering warnings to those wealthy enough to pay for them. A merchant facing ruin might seek out a connected scribe, pay handsomely, and receive cryptic advice that made no sense on its surface, but would save him from violating a secret statute. These transactions left almost no records. Their entire purpose was remaining invisible. But occasionally they surface in account books as unexplained payments to low-level officials for unspecified services. Some attempted more ambitious forms of resistance. There's evidence of what historians now call legal theatre. Public performances and sermons containing coded information about hidden laws. A traveling preacher might tell a parable about a man punished for unknowingly crossing an invisible boundary. To most listeners, it was just a moral story about God's mysterious justice. But to those who understood the code, it was a warning about a specific secret travel restriction in that region. These efforts required extraordinary care. The information had to be obscured enough to avoid prosecution, but clear enough to help those paying attention. Court records suggest some succeeded. In 1356, a German priest was investigated for seditious preaching, but authorities couldn't prove he'd actually revealed forbidden knowledge. His sermons, when examined, seemed perfectly orthodox. Only the sudden change in local behavior, people avoiding certain activities the priest had never explicitly mentioned, suggested he'd found a way to communicate what couldn't be spoken. But loyalty provided no protection. The informed few were useful until they became dangerous, and authorities made that determination arbitrarily. A scribe who had faithfully copied secret documents for 20 years might be executed simply because he'd accumulated too much knowledge, seen too many patterns, become too valuable a target for enemies of the current regime. His years of service meant nothing. His discretion was irrelevant. The knowledge itself was the crime. In 1372, 3 senior legal clerks in the English court system were simultaneously arrested and executed within a week. No charges were publicly announced. No trials occurred. Records show only that they were removed. Modern historians have found evidence suggesting they discussed among themselves the possibility of compiling a comprehensive record of secret laws, not to reveal them publicly, but simply to create an organized system for their own reference. That discussion, held in private, somehow reached the wrong ears. They died knowing exactly why, and no one else was allowed to know at all. But knowledge, even dangerous knowledge, sometimes escaped individual minds. Sometimes it spread to groups. Sometimes those groups became angry enough to fight back. In 1381, a group of English rebels fought and died for a reason historians have never properly understood. They weren't fighting for lower taxes or better wages. They were fighting against laws that don't appear in any history book, because the laws themselves were the secret. For centuries, scholars have analyzed medieval peasant revolts as responses to economic oppression or feudal abuse. Taxation, hunger, and brutality were certainly factors. But evidence that has only recently been properly contextualized reveals something more specific. Some uprisings weren't just reactions to general conditions. They were targeted attacks on secret legal systems that rebels had somehow discovered. The 1320s uprising in rural France is recorded in historical accounts as a bread riot, a spontaneous explosion of hungry anger. But documents discovered in a monastery archive in 1847 tell a different story. The villagers had somehow obtained or seen a manor legal text describing a hidden statute that gave their lord the right to confiscate grain stores arbitrarily, regardless of famine conditions or peasant need. This wasn't emergency requisition. It was permanent legal authority that had been exercised quietly for generations. When the villagers confronted authorities with this knowledge, they were told the document was a forgery, that such laws didn't exist. But the villagers had seen enforcement. They'd watched confiscations happen and had been told they were lawful. Now they knew the law that made it lawful, and they knew it had been hidden from them deliberately. The riot that followed wasn't about hunger alone. Witness testimony recorded decades later, when participants were old and dying, describes rebels specifically demanding the burning of false laws and hidden rules. The authorities never acknowledged what they were actually fighting against. They suppressed it as economic unrest and moved on. Then there were the church burnings. Between 1270 and 1285, 17 churches across a specific region of Germany were burned by what authorities described as roving bandits or heretical groups. But when scholars mapped these burnings against later discovered archive records, a pattern emerged. Every single burned church had housed secret legal documents in its sacristy. Not general church records, specific collections of hidden statutes governing local jurisdictions. The burnings weren't random attacks on Christianity. They were targeted strikes against information repositories. The evidence suggests someone had leaked the locations. The fires were too precise, too focused on specific chambers within larger church complexes. In 3 cases, the main sanctuary was left untouched, while the archive room was completely destroyed. Someone knew where the documents were kept, and someone wanted them gone. Most remarkable were the English parchment burners of 1381, a subgroup within the larger peasants' revolt. While other rebels attacked tax collectors or wealthy nobles, this group had a different target: legal documents. They broke into manor houses and went straight to archive chambers. They invaded monasteries and demanded access to legal records. They forced their way into castle vaults and burned everything they found. To contemporary observers and later historians, this seemed anarchic, almost nihilistic, destroying law itself. But recent analysis of which specific documents they targeted suggests extraordinary precision. They weren't burning all legal records. They were burning specific categories of documents, the ones that contained hidden statutes and secret regulations. Someone in that group knew what to look for. Someone understood the system well enough to attack its foundations. These rebellions largely failed. A mass movement requires shared understanding, and you cannot build shared understanding around laws people don't know exist. Authorities could suppress the uprisings while never acknowledging the actual grievance. The rebels died angry, but what exactly they were angry about remained obscure to everyone else. Some rebellions did destroy specific secret laws, burned the only copies, killed the officials who had memorized them, disrupted the systems that maintained them. But because the laws were never public, there was no way to declare victory. the oppression simply stopped. People's lives quietly improved for reasons they never fully understood. No history was written. No heroes were celebrated. The victories were as invisible as the laws themselves. But what exactly were these laws? What were the actual words that medieval authorities were so desperate to hide? There's a medieval law so disturbing that scholars spent centuries trying to prove it never existed. They were wrong. The law was real. It was written down. And it was hidden for a reason that makes perfect, horrible sense. The jus primae noctis, the right of first night, has been debated by historians for generations. Many dismissed it as folklore, a later invention designed to make the medieval period seem more barbaric than it actually was. Others argued that even if individual abuses occurred, there was no systematic legal framework. The evidence, they insisted, simply wasn't there. But the evidence was there. It was just locked in the same archives that held every other secret law. Documentary analysis, conducted over the past 30 years, particularly of northern French seigneurial records and Scottish baronial legal codes from the 13th and 14th centuries, reveals something more complex and more disturbing than the simplified legend suggests. The practice of lords literally claiming sexual access to newlywed brides from peasant families was rare. But the legal right to do so existed in specific jurisdictions. And it existed as written statute, not merely as individual criminal abuse. A legal text from a 14th century French manor, discovered in 1987 during the restoration of a monastery that had absorbed the manor's records, describes the right in transactional terms. It's listed among other seigneurial privileges, hunting rights, timber rights, taxation authorities, and it's described as a property right inherent to lordship over the land. The text is explicit. The lord holds the right to the first night with any bride whose family holds land under his authority. But there's a provision. The right can be purchased out of for a fee, typically equivalent to several months of a peasant family's income. The legal language treats this as a form of marriage tax, with the implicit threat spelled out in the document's procedural section. If the fee is not paid and the lord chooses to exercise his right, there is a formal claiming process involving witnesses and documentation. It was systematized. It was bureaucratized. It was law. The genius, if such a word can be applied to something so grotesque, was that the right rarely needed to be exercised. Its existence was the mechanism of control. Families paid the fee. They borrowed. They sold possessions. They indebted themselves for years, all to avoid the possibility of the right being invoked. The lord collected revenue without the complications that actual enforcement would create. But evidence shows the right was invoked, though documentation is deliberately sparse. A Scottish case from 1318 involves a legal dispute between a lord and a vassal knight over who held the right in a particular village. The dispute wasn't whether the right existed. Both parties accepted that as given. They were arguing over whose authority applied in that specific location. The case was adjudicated by a higher noble who ruled in favor of one claimant, and the written judgment survives. It treats the right as routine property law, no different than settling who owned timber rights or taxation authority. Another document, from northern France in 1356, describes a case where a family fled their land to avoid both the fee and the potential invocation of the right. They were legally pursued for abandoning their holding, captured, and returned. The manor record notes the fee was extracted retroactively, with additional penalties for flight. The entire transaction is documented in the same ledger that records grain yields and livestock counts. What made this law particularly insidious was its deliberate vagueness in any public context. When the right was mentioned in public records, tax rolls, land transfers, public court proceedings, it was referred to euphemistically or not at all. But in private legal documents shared only among nobility, the language was explicit and procedural. Some texts included detailed guidelines: how the claiming would occur, what witnesses were required, how the documentation would be maintained to protect the lord's legal standing. This wasn't individual nobles abusing power in isolation. It was a legal framework maintained across multiple jurisdictions, with procedures and precedents and bureaucratic mechanisms. Later, historians resisted this evidence, partly because of its implications. If this was law rather than crime, if it was systematized rather than aberrational, it means something deeply uncomfortable about medieval legal culture. It means sexual coercion wasn't just tolerated, it was codified. It wasn't lawlessness, it was law itself. That distinction matters because it shows how deeply power can corrupt the very structures meant to limit it. The right of first night represented the ultimate exercise of control. Legal authority over another person's body, over the most intimate moments of their life, made systematic and rendered invisible to anyone who couldn't access the private legal codes where it was actually written down. But bodies weren't the only thing medieval law sought to control. Movement itself, the simple act of going from one place to another, was also subject to hidden legal frameworks that trapped people more completely than any physical prison. In medieval England, you could be born, live, and die without ever traveling more than 10 miles from your birthplace. Not because you didn't want to, because it was illegal. And you probably never knew there was a law keeping you trapped. The control of human movement was one of medieval power's most effective tools, and it operated almost entirely through secret legal frameworks. Most people are familiar with the English Statute of Labourers, passed in 1351 after the Black Death had devastated the workforce. The public version focused on wage controls, preventing workers from demanding higher pay when labour became scarce. What history classes don't teach is that accompanying this public statute were secret regulatory texts that went much further. These companion documents, discovered in ecclesiastical archives in the 19th and 20th centuries, specified that seeking information about opportunities elsewhere was itself prosecutable. A peasant couldn't legally ask a travelling merchant about conditions in the next county. He couldn't inquire whether another lord was offering better terms. The act of looking for options was defined as a violation, even if no actual movement occurred. The legal reasoning was recorded in private judicial guidance. Allowing workers to even know about alternatives would undermine the entire system of bound labour. In the German territories, the Zusegrecht systems created what can only be described as legal prisons disguised as towns. These local laws, which varied by jurisdiction but followed similar patterns, made it illegal for outsiders to settle without purchasing settlement rights, often at costs that took years to accumulate. But the reverse was also true, and far less publicly acknowledged. Current residents couldn't leave without formally surrendering property and paying exit fees that most could never afford. You were trapped not by walls, but by legal architecture that made departure technically impossible. A resident might save for years, finally accumulate enough to consider moving, only to discover that the exit documentation required approvals from multiple authorities, each requiring separate fees, and that the total cost was deliberately set just beyond reach. The system was designed to keep people in place while maintaining the illusion that movement was theoretically possible. Then there were the travel documentation requirements that existed across most of medieval Europe, but were rarely codified in public law. To travel beyond your immediate area required authorization, a letter from your lord, approval from local church officials, or documentation of legitimate purpose. But the rules for what counted as legitimate purpose, who could grant authorization, and how far you could travel without it were never publicly specified. They existed in the practiced knowledge of officials and the secret guidelines they followed. The case of Thomas Art Mere, a 14th century English peasant, demonstrates how this worked in practice. Court records from 1362 document his prosecution for travelling 15 miles from his home manor to visit his dying mother in another village. He had no authorization. His defense, recorded in the trial transcript, was simple. No one told me I needed permission. The judge's response has been preserved. Ignorance of law is no excuse. Thomas was fined an amount equivalent to 6 months of labor and imprisoned for 3 weeks. The law he violated was never shown to him. It wasn't in any public record. It simply existed in the legal framework that governed his life without his knowledge. These weren't isolated incidents. Court records show that unauthorized movement cases appeared regularly, suggesting the laws were actively enforced. But more telling is the evidence of resources expended tracking down people who fled. Manor records document paid searches, correspondence between lords about returned runaways, and detailed accounting of the costs of pursuit and capture. The system required constant maintenance, which suggests it wasn't naturally accepted, but deeply resented and frequently resisted. People tried to escape. They ran at night, they forged documents, they created networks that helped each other disappear into cities where enforcement was harder. The fact that authorities built elaborate mechanisms to prevent escape reveals how trapped people felt and how desperately they wanted freedom of movement that we now consider a basic human right. Feudalism is often described as an economic system, but these legal frameworks reveal it was also a prison system, not metaphorically, literally. People were legally bound to places by invisible chains of secret law, unable to seek better lives, not because opportunity didn't exist elsewhere, but because the act of seeking was itself criminal. But physical movement wasn't the deepest level of control. Medieval authorities went further still, into the realm of thought itself, creating legal frameworks that made even private belief a punishable offense. In 1245, a woman was burned alive for a crime, committed entirely in her mind. No witnesses, no actions, just thoughts she'd never spoken aloud. The law that killed her was never written in any public document, yet the judges who sentenced her acted with complete legal authority. Medieval authorities understood that controlling actions wasn't enough. To maintain total power, they needed to control thought itself. And so they created legal frameworks for punishing ideas, doubts, and questions. Frameworks that operated largely in secret because publicly acknowledging them would reveal how deeply power sought to penetrate human consciousness. The intersection of church law and secular law created particularly dangerous territory. Heresy prosecutions are well known in medieval history, but what's less discussed is how the actual legal definitions of heresy were deliberately kept vague and partially secret. Public pronouncements condemned heresy in general terms, deviation from church teaching, rejection of Christ, worship of false gods. But the specific beliefs that constituted prosecutable heresy were enumerated in documents that accused heretics never saw. Inquisitorial law operated on a principle of secret knowledge. The inquisitor knew what questions to ask, what answers constituted guilt, and what beliefs were forbidden. The accused knew none of this. Defense was impossible because you couldn't know what you were defending against. Confessions were extracted not through torture alone, but through systematic interrogation, designed to reveal thoughts the accused didn't know were illegal. The case of Marguerite of Burgundy, recorded in fragmented church documents from the 13th century, illustrates this with chilling clarity. She was a merchant's wife, literate, by all accounts conventionally pious. During confession, she mentioned to her priest that she sometimes wondered how bread could literally become Christ's flesh during Mass. Not that she disbelieved, just that she wondered about the mechanism. The priest reported this to local church authorities as suspected heresy. She was arrested and interrogated. The questions focused not on what she believed, but on what she had thought privately. Had she ever doubted transubstantiation? Had these thoughts occurred during Mass? Had she discussed these wonderings with anyone else? Her answers, recorded in the inquisitorial record, were honest. Yes, she had wondered. No, she didn't disbelieve. She was simply curious about something she'd been taught to accept. The inquisitors consulted their private legal manuals and determined that private questioning of church doctrine, even without active disbelief, constituted suspected heresy. She was given opportunity to recant thoughts she hadn't known were illegal. She complied, but the recantation was judged insufficient because she couldn't adequately prove the sincerity of her renewed belief. She was burned. The legal reasoning was recorded in sealed church documents that wouldn't be discovered for 500 years. There was also the concept of behavioral heresy. You could be guilty not for holding forbidden beliefs, but for acting in ways that suggested you might. A German scholar named Wilhelm of Schwaben was executed in 1289 for possessing books, not obviously heretical texts. They were philosophy and natural science works that weren't on any public prohibition list, but they appeared on secret church indexes of suspicious materials, books that suggested dangerous curiosity. His possession of these texts was treated as evidence of heretical tendency, even without proof he held any specific forbidden belief. The inquisitorial logic, preserved in case notes, was that certain forms of knowledge led inevitably to heretical thinking, and therefore possession of that knowledge was itself prosecutable. Curiosity became criminal. Secret inquisitorial manuals, several of which have survived and been analyzed by modern scholars, listed hundreds of subtle behavioral indicators that warranted investigation. Asking too many questions during religious instruction. Owning an unusual number of books. Expressing interest in translation of scripture. Being reported by neighbors as seeming thoughtful or withdrawn. These weren't laws in the conventional sense. They were guidelines that inquisitors memorized and applied, creating a web of suspicion where any intellectual or spiritual curiosity could trigger investigation. The result was a culture of self-censorship that went beyond actions into the realm of pure thought. People learned to fear their own questions, to suppress their own doubts, to perform belief so thoroughly that even they couldn't distinguish performance from genuine conviction. The law didn't just punish forbidden thoughts. It created psychological conditions where people policed their own minds. Perhaps most disturbing were cases where individuals were executed for heresy without ever confessing to any specific belief. Simply failing to adequately demonstrate orthodox belief was enough. The legal standard, found in hidden church legal codes but never publicly acknowledged, was that absence of proof of orthodoxy constituted evidence of heresy. You had to prove your thoughts were acceptable, but you couldn't know what thoughts would be deemed acceptable until after you were interrogated. The control was total, and it was all legal, but legal according to laws you were never allowed to see. So why? Why go to such elaborate lengths to control bodies, movement, and thought? What did all this secrecy actually accomplish for those who created it? Medieval tax collectors had a perfect scam. They could charge you 3 times the legal rate, and when you protested, they'd show you a document proving you actually owed 5 times as much. The document was real. The law was real. You'd just never been allowed to see it. Secret laws weren't just about control. They were about money. Specifically, they were about extracting wealth in ways that would have caused immediate revolts if people understood the full scope of what was being taken from them. The financial engineering behind medieval taxation was remarkably sophisticated, built on layers of hidden legal frameworks that turned announced taxes into entry points for far more extensive extraction. Consider bridge tolls, a common medieval revenue source. The public justification was straightforward. Tolls funded bridge maintenance and paid for guards who kept the crossing safe. A merchant would expect to pay a reasonable fee when crossing with goods. What he didn't know was that secret regulations authorized collectors to add inspection fees, documentation fees, verification fees, and various other charges that appeared nowhere in public announcements. Each additional fee had legal justification in hidden statutes. The merchant paid them because the alternative was being barred from crossing, and he had no legal grounds to protest because he couldn't access the law being invoked against him. French royal accounts from the 14th century, analyzed by economic historians in recent decades, reveal entire revenue categories with no corresponding public legal basis. Money flowing into royal treasuries under headings that don't match any announced tax or fee. These weren't accounting errors or corruption. They were revenues collected under authority of laws that officially didn't exist. The scribes recording these transactions knew they were legal. The collectors knew they were legal. The people paying them had no idea what legal authority justified the extraction. The practice of law layering took this further. A single transaction, say transporting grain to market, might trigger multiple hidden fees, each justified by different secret statutes. A public transportation tax was announced, but accompanying it were unpublished regulations about inspection requirements, quality verification, documentation of origin, and route approval. Each carried fees. The merchant paid the public tax, then encountered 4 additional charges, justified by authorities he had to trust were operating legally because he had no way to verify their claims. An Italian merchant's account books from the 1370s survived in a family archive and were analyzed by scholars in the late 20th century. The marginal notes tell a story of profound confusion and helplessness. He meticulously tracked every official payment, comparing them to publicly stated rates. His calculations showed he was paying nearly 60% more than the announced tax burden should have been. His notes express bewilderment. Charged again for inspection, though goods were inspected yesterday. Told this is different inspection, required by separate authority. Cannot find record of this law. Another entry. Official claims I owe documentation fee for previous shipment from 3 months past. I paid all fees then, but he shows document I've never seen establishing new requirement retroactive to that date. Cannot protest. Have no standing to challenge law I'm only now learning exists. This system concentrated wealth upward more efficiently than any public taxation scheme could achieve. Public taxes can be protested, negotiated, bargained over in assemblies or councils. Hidden taxes couldn't be protested because their existence couldn't be challenged. You couldn't argue a fee was unjust when you couldn't prove whether the legal authority for it even existed. Evidence suggests this was calculated rather than accidental. Private noble accounts discovered in various archives contain tables, literal mathematical calculations of optimal extraction rates. How much could be taken from peasants before triggering flight or revolt? How many hidden fees could be layered onto announced taxes before resistance became more costly than the additional revenue? These weren't moral calculations. They were economic optimization, and secret laws provided the mechanism for maximum extraction while maintaining just enough legal appearance to prevent organized resistance. One particularly revealing document from a 15th century English manor lists secret fees alongside projected revenue and notes on enforcement difficulty. Higher hidden fees generated more revenue but required more enforcement resources. Lower hidden fees generated less revenue but were nearly self-enforcing because people paid without questioning. The manor lord steward had found the optimal balance, high enough to significantly increase revenue, low enough that most people paid, without fully understanding they were being exploited beyond the announced rates. The system wasn't just about taking more money. It was about taking it invisibly. Maintaining the fiction of reasonable taxation while the actual burden was far higher, and ensuring that those paying couldn't organize resistance because they couldn't fully articulate what was being done to them. But money was only part of the equation. Something even more valuable was being protected by these hidden laws. A medieval peasant could work hard, get lucky, earn wealth, and buy land. What he couldn't buy was the legal right to keep it. Secret laws made success itself illegal if you were born into the wrong class. Medieval social hierarchy wasn't just reflected in law, it was actively constructed and defended through hidden legal mechanisms. The official ideology claimed that social position reflected divine order and natural ability. A man born noble was noble because God made him superior. A peasant remained a peasant because that was his proper place. But ideology only works when reality doesn't obviously contradict it. When economic forces created social mobility, when peasants became wealthy, when merchants accumulated more resources than minor nobles. The system needed invisible architecture to push people back into their stagnated positions. Sumptuary laws were partially public. Announced regulations declared what each social class could wear or own, justified through arguments about maintaining proper social distinction and preventing vanity. These public laws were specific enough. Peasants couldn't wear certain colors, merchants couldn't display particular luxury goods. But accompanying these public restrictions were secret companion regulations that went much further. A document from 14th century France, discovered in a monastery archive in 1891, prohibits anyone born into the peasant class from learning specific crafts regardless of their wealth or ability. The prohibited crafts weren't luxuries, They were skilled trades like goldsmithing and certain types of weaving that generated substantial income. The legal reasoning recorded in the document's preamble is explicit. Allowing peasants to master these crafts would enable wealth accumulation that would blur class boundaries. The law doesn't prohibit peasants from being wealthy in absolute terms. It prohibits them from accessing the specific paths to wealth that might elevate them toward noble status. The case of Robert Thornton illustrates how this worked in practice. He was a 15th century English wool merchant who through entirely legal means accumulated significant wealth. He purchased an estate, built a manor house, began dressing and living as minor nobility did. He violated no public law. He had the money to sustain this lifestyle. What he didn't have was the legal right to social elevation, and that right couldn't be purchased. He was prosecuted over the course of 3 years for violations that appeared in no public legal code. The charges were technical: improper forms of property holding, violations of unspecified status restrictions, failures to maintain proper social position. The trial records show his defense consistently asked what law he had violated. The response was always the same: established law that didn't require public proclamation. He was systematically stripped of his estate, his wealth redistributed through various legal mechanisms, and he died in the same social class he'd been born into, despite his economic success. This wasn't isolated vindictiveness. It was status maintenance. Laws designed to keep everyone in their designated position, regardless of changing economic circumstances. Evidence shows literacy restrictions operated similarly. Public rhetoric claimed peasants weren't interested in learning to read. Secret church and secular regulations prohibited teaching reading to those below certain social ranks. A priest who taught peasant children faced disciplinary action. A peasant who learned anyway could be prosecuted under vague charges about exceeding his station. These restrictions intensified during periods when economic forces pushed towards social mobility. After the Black Death, when labor shortages gave workers unprecedented leverage, secret laws multiplied rapidly. Court records from the late 14th century show dramatic increases in prosecutions for violations of unstated status regulations. The economic forces were creating social disruption, and secret laws were the mechanism for legally constraining that disruption without publicly acknowledging that social position was being defended rather than naturally maintained. The genius of the system was that it kept the ideology intact. Publicly, social hierarchy reflected natural order. Privately, elaborate legal frameworks actively prevented anyone from rising beyond their birth position. Success didn't lead to social elevation, it led to legal destruction, designed to look like natural consequences rather than systematic suppression. But wealth and status were only 2 pillars of control. The third was political stability itself. Medieval kings rarely executed political opponents for treason. That would look bad. Instead, they'd execute them for violating obscure laws about grain storage or improper horse documentation. The charges were technically true. The trials were technically legal. And the opposition was definitely eliminated. Secret laws functioned as weapons against political opposition more effectively than any public proclamation of tyranny ever could. The mechanism was elegant. When legal codes are sufficiently elaborate and sufficiently hidden, virtually everyone is technically guilty of something. That universal legal vulnerability becomes a tool that can be deployed selectively against anyone who becomes politically inconvenient. The practice of selective prosecution left extensive documentation, though it took historians centuries to recognize the pattern. Political rivals weren't charged with political crimes. They were charged with violating obscure technical regulations that had nothing to do with their actual threat to power. The prosecutions looked like routine legal enforcement, and technically they were. The laws existed. The violations were real. Only the targeting was political. Consider the case of Henri de Montfort, a 14th century French noble who fell out of favor with the king after publicly questioning a military campaign. Within weeks, he faced prosecution for 17 different violations of laws he'd never heard of. The charges were absurdly varied. Improper livestock documentation from 3 years earlier, failure to report a land transaction that no public law required reporting, violations of grain storage regulations in a region he'd briefly traveled through. Each charge had legal basis in secret statutes that investigators had to search archives to find. Each was technically accurate, and together they destroyed him. His trial record shows a man grappling with the impossibility of defense. He couldn't argue the laws didn't exist because officials produced documentation. He couldn't argue he hadn't violated them because the violations were factually accurate. He could only argue that no reasonable person could have known these laws existed or complied with them, and that argument had no legal standing. Ignorance of law, even genuinely unknowable law, was no excuse. He was convicted on 14 of 17 charges, stripped of titles and property, and imprisoned. What makes this particularly disturbing is the practice of retroactive discovery. Authorities would discover that someone had violated a secret law months or even years earlier, providing legal justification for arrests that were purely political in motivation. The timing of the discovery always coincided with the target becoming politically problematic. The law had existed all along. The violation had occurred, but enforcement only happened when political circumstances made it useful. Evidence suggests some secret laws were intentionally written to be universally applicable, vague enough that virtually any behavior could be interpreted as a violation if authorities chose to interpret it that way. A statute about maintaining proper order could mean anything. A regulation about appropriate conduct could be applied to anyone. These weren't poorly written laws. They were deliberately constructed legal weapons that could be aimed at anyone when needed. This prevented organized opposition more effectively than open tyranny ever could. Anyone attempting to coordinate resistance could be immediately arrested on legitimate legal grounds that had nothing to do with their political activities. The arrest looked like routine law enforcement. The conviction was technically valid. The opposition was destroyed before it could organize, and the regime maintained its facade of legal legitimacy. A chronicler from 15th century Italy noted this pattern, though he wrote in careful language that avoided direct accusation. He described how men who opposed the ruling faction often found themselves prosecuted for minor infractions that everyone committed, but only opponents were charged with. He noted that the charges were always legally valid, the trials always followed proper procedure, and the outcome was always the elimination of political threats, while maintaining the appearance of justice rather than persecution. The system was more sophisticated than simple brutality. It was law weaponized while remaining law, creating opposition that was impossible because resistance could always be framed as criminality. and suppressed through legitimate legal mechanisms. But nothing lasts forever. Eventually, these elaborate systems of secret law began to crack. The question is, did they disappear or just transform? In 1476, a German printer created exactly 300 copies of a legal document. Within weeks, authorities raided his shop, burned his press, and executed 2 of his apprentices. The document wasn't treasonous, it wasn't heretical. It was simply true. And that truth was illegal to multiply. For centuries, secret laws had survived because controlling information meant controlling manuscripts. A manuscript required months to copy, each reproduction monitored, each scribe accountable. Authorities knew where every copy existed, who possessed it, who had read it. The infrastructure of secrecy was built on scarcity itself. The printing press destroyed that infrastructure overnight. When Johann Gutenberg perfected movable type in the 1450s, he was thinking about Bibles and commercial opportunity, not legal revolution. But the technology carried implications no one fully grasped at first. A printed document could be reproduced identically, rapidly, cheaply. Where a manuscript might exist in 5 carefully controlled copies, a printed text could exist in 500. And each of those could become the source for 500 more. The German printer who died in 1476 had committed no traditional crime. He had simply printed a regional legal code that authorities preferred to keep functionally hidden. The laws weren't officially secret. Technically, someone could request to view the manuscript version in the courthouse. But requesting meant identifying yourself, explaining your interest, accepting official scrutiny. The printed version required none of that. It was anonymous access to power's rulebook. Authorities understood immediately what this meant. They burned the printed copies they could find, destroyed the press, killed the apprentices as warning to other printers. But the action revealed their desperation. Some copies had already left the city. Others had been hidden. The information had escaped control. For the next century, Europe experienced an uneven, chaotic transition. Secret laws and printed culture coexisted uneasily, creating bizarre contradictions. Some jurisdictions embraced printing for certain laws while keeping others manuscript only. Public criminal laws appeared in print, while procedural rules governing trials remained hidden in courthouse manuscripts. Tax codes were published, but the rules determining who qualified for exemptions stayed secret. The system was fragmenting under technological pressure. The evidence of official panic appears throughout the period. Printers were prosecuted not for printing secret documents, but for printing documents that had been functionally hidden through manuscript scarcity. The distinction mattered legally, but not practically. Authorities were trying to maintain a system of accessibility-based secrecy in an age when accessibility itself was transforming. They were attempting to preserve darkness in a room where someone had invented the light switch. Some responses bordered on absurd. Certain German principalities made it illegal to own printed legal texts without official permission, even though the laws themselves weren't classified as secret. Italian city-states created licensing systems for legal printers, requiring approval before any statute could be reproduced. French authorities maintained lists of banned legal publications, not because the content was false, but because it was accurate and accessible. The resistance reveals how deeply the system depended on controlled information. As literacy spread and printing became cheaper, the infrastructure of secret law collapsed. By the 1550s, maintaining legal secrecy through manuscript control had become effectively impossible in most of Europe. The information environment had fundamentally changed. But the end of secret laws didn't arrive automatically with the printing press. Technology created possibility, not inevitability. The authorities who had built their power on hidden law didn't surrender it willingly. Some jurisdictions reformed, officially acknowledging their legal codes and committing to transparency. Others doubled down, executing printers and banning categories of legal publishing entirely, trying to maintain secrecy through increasingly desperate measures. The printing press had broken the silence. But silence, once broken, doesn't guarantee truth will be heard. It only guarantees that the fight over truth becomes visible. And that fight was just beginning. In 1527, the citizens of a German town did something revolutionary. They demanded to see the laws governing them. When authorities refused, the citizens responded not with violence, but with something more powerful. They simply stopped obeying until the laws were made visible. The authorities eventually surrendered. The standoff lasted 3 years. No taxes paid, no court judgments acknowledged, no official authority recognized. The town functioned through informal consensus while authorities watched their power evaporate. Finally, in 1530, they produced what the citizens had demanded: a comprehensive written code of every law applicable to the town, publicly posted, available for copying. The citizens returned to normal legal compliance the same week. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across Europe, the late 1400s and early 1500s saw an explosion of movements demanding legal transparency. The printing press had made secret law technologically obsolete, but technology alone hadn't eliminated it. What followed was a political and ideological struggle to force authorities to abandon secrecy entirely. The intellectual climate was shifting. Renaissance humanism emphasized reason and knowable principles. The Protestant Reformation challenged the Catholic Church's secret authority and hidden procedures. Early Enlightenment thinkers began articulating a radical idea. Legitimate law must be knowable law. Rules that governed people's lives couldn't remain invisible to those whose lives they governed. Hidden law wasn't just inconvenient, it was tyranny by definition. France moved first at the national level. The Ordonnance de Montilz-les-Tours in 1453 ordered the systematic codification of customary law. The regional, often unwritten rules that had governed communities for centuries. What had been hidden local practice became subject to review, standardization, publication. It was an acknowledgement that functional secrecy, even without official classification, was no longer acceptable. England followed differently. The 16th century saw an explosion of legal publishing. Case law, statutes, procedural guides. These weren't official government publications. They were commercial ventures by legal professionals responding to market demand. The public wanted to know the law, and printers were happy to supply that knowledge for profit. Authorities couldn't stop it without acknowledging they preferred secrecy, an increasingly untenable political position. Italian city-states experienced something remarkable: the syndicatist movements. Communities demanded the right to review not just the laws, but the legal authorities governing them. They wanted to examine the credentials, the procedures, the hidden frameworks of legal power itself. Some cities successfully negotiated agreements requiring regular public review of judicial appointments and legal procedures. transparency extending beyond law into the machinery of justice itself. But resistance remained fierce. Authorities who had benefited from secret laws fought publication at every step. Their arguments were sometimes sophisticated. Making laws too accessible, they claimed, would create chaos. Criminals would exploit knowledge of legal procedures. The ignorant would misunderstand complex statutes. Social order required some discretion in governance. These weren't purely cynical arguments. Some officials genuinely believed secrecy served legitimate purposes. The debates from this period are fascinating and uncomfortable. One French legal scholar argued in 1510 that certain laws should remain hidden because public knowledge would encourage violation, essentially claiming that effective law enforcement required ignorance. A Venetian authority insisted that procedural complexity itself was a feature, not a bug, because it prevented frivolous legal challenges. An English judge wrote that some discretionary powers must remain undefined because codification would limit judicial wisdom. These arguments lost. Not completely, not immediately, but gradually and decisively. The cultural momentum had shifted toward transparency as a political value, not just a practical convenience. Secret law was increasingly understood as illegitimate law, regardless of its content or purpose. Yet the victory created hybrid systems. Some laws were published, while others remained hidden. Criminal statutes became public, while administrative procedures stayed secret. Tax codes were available, while exemption qualifications remained obscure. The legal landscape became complex, contradictory, partially transparent, but still partially opaque. The reform movements had forced change, but they hadn't achieved complete victory. Secret law was wounded, weakened, forced into retreat. But retreat isn't elimination. And as we'll see, what couldn't survive openly would learn to survive in other forms. In 1998, a British legal scholar discovered a medieval statute that was technically still law. It hadn't been enforced in 400 years, but it had never been repealed. It was still hidden in the legal code, waiting. How many more are still there, sleeping in the shadows of modern law? The comfortable narrative suggests secret laws ended with reform movements and transparency demands. The reality is more unsettling. Many secret laws didn't disappear. They were grandfathered into new systems, forgotten but technically enforceable, or transformed into forms that escaped public scrutiny. English legal tradition includes a concept called desuetude, laws that fall out of use but remain technically valid. No one enforces them, but no one formally eliminates them either. They exist in legal limbo, ghosts in the machinery. Some of these ghosts have medieval origins. Some were originally secret laws that survived through bureaucratic oversight. No one remembered to repeal them because no one remembered they existed. The examples are specific and documented. Certain English medieval church courts maintained secret procedural rules until the 1800s, operating under frameworks that were never fully disclosed, even as they issued binding judgments. Some manorial courts, local judicial bodies governing land disputes, functioned under partly hidden customary rules until their formal abolition in the 1920s. Scottish Athings, traditional legal assemblies, maintained unwritten secret procedures until the 18th century, applying rules that were never codified or made publicly accessible. But the more significant survival wasn't direct continuation, it was transformation. Secret laws evolved into administrative law. Modern governments create vast bodies of regulations through administrative agencies, legally binding rules made without legislative approval. These regulations often function identically to medieval secret statutes. They govern people's behavior, carry legal penalties, yet remain functionally inaccessible to ordinary citizens. They're technically public, but buried in volumes of regulatory code that no one reads and few can understand. The justifications echo across centuries. Medieval authorities defended secret laws as necessary for administrative efficiency, for preventing abuse by the ignorant, for maintaining social order. Modern administrative agencies justify regulatory secrecy using nearly identical language. Efficiency, preventing frivolous challenges, maintaining effective governance. The words have changed slightly, the logic hasn't. Legal complexity itself became a new form of secrecy. Laws that are technically public, but so voluminous and intricate that they're functionally hidden from ordinary people, achieve the same result as manuscript-based secrecy. The mechanism shifted from scarcity to complexity, but the effect remained: rules, governing people's lives that those people cannot practically access or understand. The structural continuities are remarkable. Medieval laws restricting movement evolve into modern passport and visa systems. Different in form, but similar in function. Controlling where people can go through bureaucratic permission structures. Laws enforcing social hierarchy transformed into professional licensing requirements. You still need official approval to practice certain occupations, justified through public safety rather than class maintenance. Laws punishing thought crime evolved into hate speech regulations and ideological conformity requirements. The content changed, but the principle of criminalizing belief persisted. These are transformations, not direct survivals. The medieval laws didn't continue unchanged into modernity, but the principles, the structures, the fundamental approach to using hidden or complex law to control populations, those survived. They adapted to new political environments, new technological realities, new cultural sensibilities. They learned to justify themselves in modern language. The question becomes uncomfortable. Did secret laws truly end, or did they simply become more sophisticated? Did we eliminate hidden governance, or did we just stop calling it that? The medieval world seems distant until you recognize its shadows in contemporary legal systems. Then it becomes very close indeed. And that closeness raises the question we can no longer avoid. What does this mean for us now? Right now, there are laws governing your life that you cannot read. Not because they're complex, but because they're classified. Not because you lack education, but because you lack security clearance. Medieval scribes would recognize this system instantly. The parallel isn't metaphorical. It's structural. In 2013, the American public learned that the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court had been creating a substantial body of secret case law for decades. These weren't just classified decisions about specific surveillance warrants. They were legal interpretations of public statutes, rulings that fundamentally redefined what those public laws meant. Citizens were being surveilled under laws they could read, but according to interpretations they couldn't access. A medieval citizen punished under hidden law faced the same situation. The surface law appeared one way. The actual application worked differently. The crucial legal framework remained invisible. The FISA court isn't an isolated case. The Office of Legal Counsel within the Department of Justice produces legal memos that effectively determine what the government can legally do. Many of these memos remain classified for years or decades. Some have never been released. They provide legal justification for government actions that would appear illegal under public interpretations of public laws. But the memos themselves remain hidden, sometimes even from Congress. Former government officials have described navigating parallel legal systems. Public laws constrain government action. Officially, classified interpretations dramatically expand government authority. Actually, the gap between these frameworks can be enormous. An action that appears illegal under public law becomes legal under classified interpretation. Citizens challenging that action can't access the actual legal reasoning being applied. National security letters represent another medieval echo. These are administrative subpoenas issued by the FBI, requiring individuals or organizations to produce information. They often include gag orders, prohibiting recipients from acknowledging the letters even exist. You can be legally compelled to provide information to the government while being legally prohibited from telling anyone you were compelled. The process is secret. The legal justification is often classified. The target frequently doesn't know they're being targeted. The justifications for these systems echo across centuries with eerie precision. Medieval authorities argued that certain laws must remain secret for effective governance, that revealing legal frameworks would help enemies of order, that transparency would make proper administration impossible. Modern national security officials make identical arguments. Classification is necessary to protect intelligence methods. Revealing legal interpretations would help terrorists. Transparency would compromise national security operations. These aren't entirely cynical claims. Some legitimate security concerns exist. But medieval authorities also had legitimate governance concerns. The question isn't whether any justification exists. It's whether secret law can ever be compatible with justice. Specific cases reveal the problem's depth. Individuals have been prosecuted under public laws, while the actual legal reasoning relied on classified interpretations they couldn't challenge in court. Imagine defending yourself against charges without knowing the complete legal framework being applied. Imagine your lawyer being unable to access the precedents that determine your guilt. Medieval defendants faced this reality. Some modern defendants do too. The scope is difficult to determine. That's inherent to classified systems. We know the Fiesa Court has issued thousands of secret rulings. We know the Office of Legal Counsel has produced thousands of legal opinions, many classified. We know national security letters number in the tens of thousands annually. But the full extent of secret legal frameworks remains, by definition, secret. Democratic oversight exists. The medieval absolute monarchies lacked this. The Fiesa Court has judicial review, theoretically. Congress has access to classified information, supposedly. Whistleblower protections exist, in principle. These differences matter. Modern secret law operates under more constraints than medieval systems did. But the structural parallels remain undeniable. Laws you cannot access govern your behavior. Legal interpretations you cannot challenge determine your rights. Proceedings you cannot observe decide your freedoms. The mechanisms differ. The fundamental dynamic, asymmetric legal knowledge creating asymmetric power, persists. We've built systems that would be recognizable to medieval legal authorities. We've justified them using arguments those authorities would immediately understand. We've maintained the ideology of transparent justice while creating pockets of deliberate legal opacity. And this is only the explicit secrecy. The classified systems at least acknowledge they're hiding law. But there are other forms of modern legal opacity, more subtle, perhaps more pervasive. Ways of making law functionally inaccessible without officially classifying it at all. There are approximately 300,000 federal crimes in the United States. No one knows the exact number. No lawyer has read them all. You are almost certainly violating several right now without knowing it. Sound familiar? Medieval secret laws made it impossible to know what was legal. Modern legal complexity achieves the same result through different means. The U.S. Code of Federal Regulations contains roughly 185,000 pages. The tax code alone spans thousands of pages, with tens of thousands more pages of regulatory guidance. Environmental regulations, financial regulations, healthcare regulations, each system contains more rules than any individual can master. The laws are technically public. They're also functionally inaccessible. This creates what legal scholars call a complexity moat. A barrier to understanding so substantial that it protects institutions from accountability just as effectively as actual secrecy. You can request the regulations. You can attempt to read them. But comprehension requires specialized expertise, significant time investment, and often expensive legal counsel. For practical purposes, you cannot know the laws governing you. The psychological effect mirrors medieval secret law exactly. Ambient uncertainty about what's legal, inability to know when you're in compliance. Constant vulnerability to the discovery that you've been violating rules you never knew existed. A small business owner discovers she's been violating an obscure regulatory requirement for 3 years. The violation carries criminal penalties. She had no way of knowing. The regulation exists in technical language in a subsection of a guidance document for an agency she'd never heard of. Her business activities were legal, according to every source she could reasonably consult. But technically, she was a criminal the entire time. This isn't a hypothetical. These discoveries happen constantly. Research has documented that regulatory complexity disproportionately impacts smaller businesses and individuals, while larger corporations can afford entire compliance departments. The large corporation can hire teams to navigate the complexity mode. The individual cannot. This creates structural advantages that mirror medieval class-based legal systems. The powerful can afford to know the law, while others must hope they're in compliance. Then there's regulatory dark matter, the vast universe of enforcement priorities, guidance documents, and informal policies that determine how laws are actually applied but aren't themselves laws. An agency publishes a statute in clear terms. Then it issues guidance documents explaining how it will enforce that statute. Then it maintains internal priorities about which violations it will prosecute. The statute is public. The actual enforcement framework is scattered across documents of varying legal status and accessibility. Medieval courts operated similarly. Public law existed. Secret enforcement practices determined actual outcomes. The gap between official rule and actual application created a parallel legal system that governed reality, while the public system governed appearances. Algorithm-driven enforcement has intensified this dynamic. Credit scoring systems determine your economic opportunities based on opaque models you cannot examine. Content moderation algorithms enforce rules you cannot fully know. Automated benefit determinations apply criteria you cannot challenge. These systems create legally consequential rules that are opaque even in principle. proprietary algorithms applying undisclosed criteria to make decisions affecting your life. You can be denied a loan, banned from a platform, or rejected for benefits based on algorithmic determinations without ever knowing which rules you violated. The rules exist. They govern you. They are deliberately inaccessible. Terms of service agreements represent another complexity-based hiding place. These are legally binding contracts that take hours to read and require legal expertise to understand. Yet clicking agree without reading them is legally treated as informed consent. The average person encounters dozens of these agreements annually. Reading them all would require unrealistic time investment. But not reading them doesn't protect you from their terms. Research shows most people agree to terms they haven't read governing everything from data collection to dispute resolution. These terms often waive significant rights. They're technically public. You could read them if you invested the time and had the expertise. Practically, they're hidden through sheer volume and complexity. Medieval secret laws required manuscript control to hide legal frameworks. Modern systems achieve the same result through information overload. The mechanism changed. The effect, asymmetric legal knowledge favoring institutions over individuals, remains constant. We've replaced scarcity-based secrecy with complexity-based secrecy. We've made law functionally inaccessible while maintaining the ideology of transparency. We've created systems where knowing the rules governing you is effectively impossible. And there's one more medieval parallel we need to examine. Former prosecutor and judge Andrew Napolitano once wrote, "If the feds want to get you, they will find a way." He wasn't describing corruption. He was describing how the system is designed. Medieval judges would understand this perfectly. The combination of vast legal codes and prosecutorial discretion creates a system where authorities can find legal justification to target virtually anyone. This isn't theory, it's documented practice. Attorney Harvey Silverglade argued in his book that the average American unknowingly commits 3 felonies a day. The claim is controversial in its specifics, but reveals an uncomfortable truth. Criminal codes have become so broad that universal legal vulnerability is structurally built into the system. When everyone is technically guilty of something, enforcement becomes inherently selective. Medieval secret laws functioned as political weapons precisely because of their selectivity. Everyone violated something. Enforcement was reserved for those who became inconvenient. Modern legal systems have recreated this dynamic using different architecture. Protest movements provide clear examples. Participants are selectively prosecuted for violations that are technically common but rarely enforced. Jaywalking, permit violations, obstruction charges. These laws are broken constantly across cities. Enforcement is normally minimal. During politically sensitive protests, enforcement becomes aggressive. The laws haven't changed. The decision to enforce them has. Whistleblowers face similar selective prosecution. Individuals who reveal classified information are charged under espionage statutes, while previous similar conduct by politically connected individuals goes unprosecuted. The laws are applied selectively based on who violated them and what they revealed. The pattern is well documented across multiple administrations and both political parties. Financial regulations offer another example. Banking rules are enormously complex, creating countless potential violations. Which violations get prosecuted and which institutions face consequences involve substantial discretion. Internal documents from regulatory agencies show discussions about enforcement priorities that include political and economic considerations, not just legal ones. The law on paper is uniform. The law as applied is selective. This selectivity creates the same dynamics as medieval secret law. Technically accurate charges serve political or social control purposes. Legal justifications can be found for targeting anyone who becomes inconvenient. The ideology of rule of law is maintained while the system functions as an instrument of selective control. Plea bargaining intensifies the opacity. Roughly 95% of criminal convictions result from plea deals, not trials. This means actual legal outcomes happen in private negotiations between prosecutors and defense attorneys, not in public courtrooms. The law as applied is determined in these opaque proceedings, not through transparent judicial process. Medieval justice often occurred in private chambers. Modern justice mostly does too. The differential impact across communities reveals the system's structural selectivity. Over-policed communities experience aggressive enforcement of minor violations. Broken windows, policing, stop and frisk, quality of life charges. Under-policed communities receive little attention, even for serious crimes. Both groups theoretically live under the same laws. They experience radically different legal realities. This creates what legal scholars call legal pluralism. Multiple different legal systems operating simultaneously depending on who and where you are. The official legal code is uniform. The experienced legal reality varies dramatically. Medieval law openly acknowledged different rules for different classes. Modern law maintains the fiction of equality while producing similar stratification. The psychological effects mirror medieval secret law. Fear of arbitrary punishment. Inability to feel secure even when complying with known rules. The sense that legal vulnerability can be weaponized against you if you attract the wrong attention. These aren't paranoid fantasies. They're documented realities of how selective enforcement operates. Internal prosecutorial documents reveal explicit discussions about which laws to enforce against which populations. Enforcement priorities are chosen. Target populations are identified. Resources are allocated accordingly. The same laws exist on paper everywhere. Their application varies systematically. This isn't always malicious. Prosecutorial discretion exists for legitimate reasons. Not every violation deserves prosecution. Resources are limited. Priorities must be set. Medieval authorities also had legitimate governance concerns when they applied laws selectively. The question isn't whether any justification exists. It's whether a system that creates universal legal vulnerability and then enforces selectively can truly claim to be just. We've recreated core features of medieval selective prosecution using modern legal architecture. We maintain the ideology of equal justice under law while operating systems that produce systematically unequal outcomes. The mechanisms differ. The fundamental dynamic remains. But we don't have to end here, dwelling only on problems without discussing solutions. In 2013, a programmer named Aaron Swartz was prosecuted by the federal government for downloading academic articles. He faced decades in prison. His crime was making information accessible. The prosecution ended when he took his own life. The battle over who gets to access which information, including law itself, is still being fought today. There are people fighting to make law truly knowable. They're using the same weapon that broke medieval secret law, technology that makes information impossible to control. Carl Malamud is one of them. Through his organization publicresource.org, he's spent decades fighting to make legal materials freely available online. Not just statutes and court decisions, but the incorporated standards that are technically law, but only available for purchase from private organizations. Building codes, safety standards, environmental regulations, rules you must follow but must pay to read. Malamud has faced lawsuits, threats, and institutional resistance. Standards organizations claim copyright on legal materials. They argue that making their standards freely available would destroy their business model. Malamud responds that if something is law, charging money to read it is extortion. The courts have generally agreed, slowly, reluctantly, case by case. The Free Law Project takes a different approach. They're making case law accessible without paywalls. Court decisions that interpret statutes, create precedent, determine how law actually functions. These used to require expensive legal databases to access. The Free Law Project has made millions of court documents freely searchable, breaking the commercial monopoly on legal knowledge. These aren't just technical projects. They're fundamentally political. They challenge who gets to know and interpret the rules governing society. The victories are specific and documented. Lawsuits have forced government publication of standards that were legally binding but commercially restricted. Freedom of Information Act requests have revealed previously secret legal interpretations. Digital archives have preserved documents that governments preferred to make inaccessible through bureaucratic friction. An individual discovers she's being evicted under a local ordinance. She can't afford a lawyer. She finds the relevant case law through the Free Law Project. She discovers her landlord is misinterpreting the statute. She brings the correct legal interpretation to court. She wins. This wasn't possible 20 years ago. Accessing the necessary legal information would have required resources beyond her means. But the resistance to these projects reveals something uncomfortable. Making law freely accessible is controversial. Commercial legal publishers argue their businesses depend on exclusive access to legal materials. They provide valuable services: organization, annotation, analysis. Free access would destroy their business model. They're not entirely wrong about the value they provide, but they're arguing that understanding the law should require paying intermediaries. Medieval scribes made similar arguments. Government agencies resist transparency infrastructure. Making documents genuinely accessible requires investment in digital systems, standardized formats, and ongoing maintenance. It's easier to maintain the status quo where technically public information is functionally hidden through bureaucratic obstacles. Some legal professionals oppose direct public access to legal materials. They argue that law is too complex for non-experts, that unmediated access creates misunderstanding, that professional intermediaries are necessary for proper legal system functioning. These aren't entirely cynical claims. Legal interpretation does require expertise. But the argument is structurally identical to medieval justifications for keeping law hidden from those it governed. The pattern repeats across domains. Transparency advocates use technology to make information accessible. Established institutions resist, citing business models, professional standards, or governance concerns. Slowly, grudgingly, transparency wins specific battles, but the war continues. These digital activists are direct descendants of those who fought for legal transparency in the late medieval period. They're using available technology to break information monopolies. They're arguing that hidden law is incompatible with justice regardless of justifications. They're proving that making law accessible is technically possible, which means continued opacity is a choice. Aaron Swartz's prosecution revealed how seriously power takes these battles. Making information accessible is treated as a threat worthy of decades of imprisonment. The information in question was academic articles, not even law itself. But the principle was the same. Challenging who controls access to knowledge, challenges power structures built on information asymmetry. The digital transparency movement has achieved real victories, but accessibility alone doesn't solve the problem. You can make 100,000-page regulatory code freely available online, but is it actually knowable? Technology can break down access barriers, but it can't simplify complexity. In 2010, the British government asked citizens to help identify unnecessary regulations. They expected to find a few hundred outdated rules. They found over 21,000. One of them prohibited the sale of brassicas, cabbage family vegetables, without a license. No one knew why. No one could find when it started. But it was technically still law. Making law accessible is crucial. Making it comprehensible requires something more. Simplification. The movement takes various forms. Plain language legal writing initiatives try to make statutes readable by non-lawyers. Instead of the party of the first part shall indemnify, write, you must compensate. Instead of nested clauses and legal terms of art, use clear sentences and common words. Some jurisdictions have made this mandatory. New Zealand's Plain Language Act requires government communications be clear and concise. But plain language addresses symptoms, not causes. The fundamental problem isn't just how laws are written, it's how many exist. Regulatory reform movements advocate for sunset provisions. Laws should expire automatically unless explicitly renewed. This forces periodic review, preventing the accumulation of forgotten rules that remain technically enforceable. It also requires legislators to prioritize. If you must actively renew regulations, you will focus on ones that matter. Some proposals go further. Regulatory budgets. New regulations can only be added if old ones are removed. The total volume of law is capped. Want to regulate something new? Find something currently regulated that matters less. This forces explicit trade-offs rather than endless accumulation. Estonia has built its digital government on simplification principles. Their e-governance system makes rules transparent, digitally enforceable, and regularly reviewed. The process of creating new regulations requires demonstrating necessity and eliminating contradictions with existing rules. It's not perfect, but it's structurally designed to prevent the regulatory sprawl that creates functional opacity. The British Red Tape Challenge revealed what happens when you systematically review existing regulations. Beyond the cabbage licensing requirement, they found rules governing the size of bread loaves from the 1800s, restrictions on activities that no longer existed, and conflicting regulations where following one meant violating another. Thousands were eliminated. The legal system continued functioning. Nothing broke. This suggests much legal complexity serves no current purpose. It accumulated over time, each addition seeming reasonable individually, the aggregate becoming incomprehensible. Like a house where each generation adds a room without removing anything, eventually the structure becomes uninhabitable. But simplification faces deep resistance. Regulatory capture explains some of it. industries often prefer complex regulations that benefit established players. A simple rule applies equally to everyone. A complex rule with exceptions, carve-outs, and technical requirements favors those who can afford compliance departments. Incumbent businesses can handle complexity. New competitors cannot. Complex law becomes a barrier to entry. Bureaucratic inertia is another factor. Government agencies develop institutional cultures around managing complexity. Their expertise is navigating intricate regulatory frameworks. Simplification threatens their relevance. This isn't purely cynical. They genuinely believe their work is necessary, but their incentive is toward complexity, not clarity. Then there are genuine questions about whether simplification is even possible. Modern society is complex. Financial systems, environmental regulations, healthcare standards. These domains may require complex rules. Some legal scholars argue that the desire for simple law is naive nostalgia. Comprehensive justice requires comprehensive law. Simplification advocates respond that most complexity serves special interests, not genuine necessity. They point to Estonia's digital government and jurisdictions that have successfully simplified without sacrificing justice. They argue that complexity often obscures rather than captures nuance, and that clearer rules actually produce fairer outcomes. The philosophical debate is profound. Is knowable law achievable in modern society? What's the acceptable balance between comprehensive regulation and comprehensible regulation? Can we have both justice and simplicity? The evidence suggests simplification is possible but difficult. It requires political will to overcome institutional resistance. It requires accepting that simpler systems may regulate less comprehensively. It requires prioritizing knowability over theoretical completeness. The most revealing aspect is what simplification exposes. When you make rules clearer, it becomes obvious who benefits and who bears costs. Complex law obscures these distributional effects. A 1,000-page tax code hides how benefits flow. A clear system makes winners and losers visible. This explains much of the resistance. Complexity provides political cover. Simplified systems are more transparent about their choices. That transparency creates accountability. Those benefiting from current arrangements prefer the complexity that makes their advantages less visible. But transparency and simplification still operate within existing legal architecture. They make systems more knowable without fundamentally changing power dynamics. Can we reimagine law itself? What if the problem isn't that laws are hidden, but that there are too many laws to know? Some legal scholars now argue the only way to have truly knowable law is to have shockingly less of it. They might be right, but what would we lose? The question pushes beyond reform into reimagination. Not making existing systems more transparent, but designing fundamentally different legal architectures. Constitutional limits on legal volume represent one approach. What if constitutions capped how much law could exist? No more than 10,000 pages of enforceable statutes. No more than 100 federal crimes. No regulations exceeding a total word count. This would force radical prioritization. If you want to regulate something new, you must deregulate something old. It would make comprehensive knowledge theoretically achievable. Critics argue this is simplistic. Modern society faces challenges medieval communities never encountered. Financial derivatives, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, these domains require sophisticated regulation. Artificial limits on legal volume would create gaps that exploitation would find immediately. But minimalist advocates respond that most law regulates not genuinely complex modern phenomena, but ordinary human behavior through ever-expanding definitions. The vast majority of criminal law could be replaced with general principles against harm, fraud, and coercion. Most regulatory law could be eliminated if we accepted that not every risk requires a rule. Blockchain-based legal systems explore different possibilities. What if every law modification was permanently recorded in transparent, unalterable ledgers? What if legal changes required cryptographic validation from multiple parties? This wouldn't simplify law, but it would make changes traceable and prevent secret modifications. It's transparency through technology rather than political will. Code as law takes this further. In some digital communities, rules are enforced through automated systems rather than human discretion. Smart contracts execute automatically when conditions are met. There's no selective enforcement because enforcement is algorithmic. This theoretically eliminates the discretion that enables legal weaponization, but it creates new problems. Algorithmic enforcement is merciless, no room for context, mercy, or human judgment, and someone still writes the algorithms, embedding their choices and biases in supposedly neutral code. You've replaced discretionary enforcement with discretionary design. Restorative justice movements propose another direction entirely. Minimize formal law. Resolve conflicts through community-based processes. Instead of standardized rules applied by distant authorities, have affected parties determine appropriate responses to harm. Less law means less opportunity for legal opacity. These systems have worked in specific communities and contexts. They produce different outcomes than formal law, more focused on healing than punishment, more flexible than rigid rules. But they depend on community cohesion that may not scale to large, diverse populations. And they risk perpetuating existing power imbalances when dominant community voices determine restoration. Legal minimalism represents the intellectual foundation for many of these approaches. The argument is straightforward. The best defense against hidden law is having less law overall. Fewer rules means greater possibility of knowing them. Clear, bright-line rules replacing complex balancing tests means less discretionary interpretation. Minimal law means minimal opacity. The counter-arguments are substantial. Complexity isn't arbitrary. It reflects genuine social complexity. Simplification often privileges those who can exploit loopholes in simple systems. Minimalist law may remove legal protections that guard against private power. The medieval period had relatively simple law, and we've spent this documentary showing how that enabled oppression. The fundamental dilemma may be inherent to large-scale governance. Comprehensive law becomes complex and effectively secret. Simple law may be knowable but insufficient. There may be no resolution, only trade-offs. But different legal traditions have approached these questions differently. The Western legal tradition's emphasis on written comprehensive codes isn't universal. Some cultures developed sophisticated governance with less formal law. Some communities maintain order through norms rather than rules. These alternatives haven't scaled to modern nation-states, but they suggest current approaches aren't inevitable. They're choices reflecting specific historical paths. The question becomes, are there paths we haven't explored? Could genuinely new approaches escape the traps that have recurred across centuries? Or are these dilemmas fundamental to human governance? repeating endlessly in new forms. We've traced secret law from medieval manuscripts to modern complexity. We've seen how it breaks, transforms, and returns. Now, we need to step back and ask, what have we learned? Secret laws aren't created by evil masterminds in dark rooms. They're created by ordinary officials responding to genuine crises with temporary measures that become permanent systems. Once you see the pattern, you see it everywhere across history, including in places you didn't expect. The life cycle repeats with remarkable consistency across centuries and cultures. Stage 1 is crisis and exception. Secret laws typically emerge during crises when authorities claim normal rules are insufficient. Medieval plague outbreaks triggered emergency health regulations that operated outside normal legal frameworks. Authorities needed to act quickly, they argued, without the delays of public legal process. The measures were temporary. The emergency justified secrecy. Modern national security law follows the identical pattern. The crisis is terrorism rather than plague, but the logic is the same. Normal legal procedures are too slow, too public, too constraining. Extraordinary threats require extraordinary measures. The measures are temporary, just until the crisis passes. The secrecy is necessary. Revealing our methods helps our enemies. Stage 2 is normalization. Temporary measures become permanent. The crisis extends, or new crises emerge before old ones fully resolve. The emergency powers that were supposed to sunset instead continue. But the ideology of temporariness remains. These are still emergency measures, still exceptional, still justified by ongoing threat. They just happen to last decades. Medieval emergency taxation became permanent hidden revenue systems. The war ended, but the taxes continued under different justifications. Temporary wartime surveillance authorities become permanent features of governance. The war on terror has no defined endpoint, so emergency measures never expire. The exception becomes the rule, while maintaining the language of exception. Stage 3 is expansion. Once secret law is normalized in one domain, it expands to others. Mechanisms created for exceptional circumstances find routine applications. Precedent is powerful. If secrecy is justified here, why not there? Medieval market regulations began as crisis price controls during famines. Authorities needed to prevent hoarding, ensure distribution, maintain order during genuine emergency. But the regulatory mechanisms proved useful beyond crisis. They expanded into comprehensive economic governance, controlling prices, limiting competition, privileging certain merchants. The crisis justification faded, while the secret control mechanisms persisted and grew. Modern surveillance authorities follow the same trajectory. Systems created to monitor terrorism, suspects get used for routine crime investigation, then for immigration enforcement, then for tracking activists. The infrastructure exists. The legal authority is broad. The expansion happens gradually, each step seeming reasonable. The accumulated scope only visible in retrospect. Stage 4 is discovery and challenge. Eventually, secret laws are discovered, sometimes through leaks. A frustrated insider reveals what shouldn't be known, sometimes through accidents. A document is misfiled, a case reveals more than intended. Sometimes through technological change. Printing presses or internet platforms make information uncontrollable. Sometimes through deliberate investigation. Journalists, activists, or reformers specifically seeking hidden law. Discovery triggers reform movements. The printing press revealed medieval secret laws. Edward Snowden revealed modern surveillance programs. In both cases, the revelation created political crisis as publics discovered they'd been governed by rules they couldn't access. Reform movements emerged demanding transparency, accountability, limits on secret authority. Stage 5 is reform or transformation. Secret law systems rarely simply disappear. They transform. Some provisions become public. Others are replaced by different forms of opacity. Some persist in modified form, now with slightly more oversight, but fundamentally unchanged. Medieval reform movements force publication of some legal codes while driving others deeper underground. Modern surveillance reform creates oversight boards and reporting requirements while leaving substantial classified authorities untouched. The system adjusts, concedes some transparency, maintains secrecy in renamed forms. This isn't inevitable progression. Systems can stall at any stage. Some societies resist the normalization of emergency measures. Some prevent expansion beyond original scope. Some create structural barriers to secrecy that force in transparency earlier. And reform can be reversed. Newly transparent systems can become opaque again when new crises emerge. But the pattern is recognizable once you've seen it. The medieval plague laws and the modern national security state are separated by centuries and vastly different contexts. But they follow the same life cycle. Crisis justification, temporary measures becoming permanent, expansion beyond original scope, eventual discovery, and transformation rather than elimination. Understanding this pattern doesn't make resisting it easy, but it makes recognition possible. When you see stage 1 beginning, when crisis is used to justify secret authority, you can anticipate what comes next. And maybe understanding the life cycle creates opportunities to intervene earlier, before temporary becomes permanent, before exception becomes rule. But why does this pattern repeat? What makes it so persistent across such different times and places? The people who create secret laws almost never see themselves as tyrants. They see themselves as responsible professionals, making difficult choices for the common good. That's what makes the pattern so hard to break. Every generation recreates it, believing this time is different. The psychology operates on several levels, all reinforcing each other. First is the illusion of control. Authorities genuinely believe that keeping certain information secret makes governance more effective. And in the short term, there's often truth to this. Secrecy does provide tactical advantages. It prevents people from evading rules they'd avoid if they knew about them. It reduces challenges that might slow implementation. It creates informational power that translates to practical authority. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Secret measures produce short-term results. Those results validate the approach. The practice expands. Research on information asymmetry shows that holding secrets provides both real advantages and psychological satisfaction. The power of knowing what others don't creates feelings of competence and control that are deeply rewarding. Second is the complexity excuse. As problems become more complex, authorities genuinely struggle to make rules accessible. There's no time to simplify, no resources to educate, no clear way to make technical regulations comprehensible to non-experts. Secrecy becomes a path of least resistance, rather than a deliberate tyrannical choice. Medieval authorities faced this with commercial regulations spanning multiple domains. They couldn't easily publish comprehensive codes across jurisdictions. Modern authorities face it with regulatory frameworks touching thousands of specialized areas. No one has the capacity to make everything accessible. The opacity emerges from accumulated individual decisions, each reasonable in isolation, none intended to create oppressive systems. This means no individual feels responsible. Everyone is just responding to immediate practical problems. The systemic injustice has no clear author. Third is the protection narrative. Authorities convince themselves they're protecting people from information they can't handle. Medieval religious authorities restricted scriptural interpretation, arguing ordinary people would misunderstand theology and damn themselves through error. Modern security officials restrict classified information, arguing that public knowledge would enable threats against the very people they're protecting. This paternalistic narrative has deep psychological appeal. It lets authorities feel virtuous while maintaining secrecy. They're not hoarding power, they're shouldering burdens. They're not oppressing people, they're protecting them from complexity or danger they couldn't navigate alone. The narrative enables otherwise ethical people to participate in oppressive systems while maintaining positive self-image. Fourth is mission creep psychology. Once systems are created for specific purposes, institutional interests and sincere mission focus drive expansion beyond original scope. Medieval inquisitors genuinely believed expanding their mandate served justice. Each new category of heresy they investigated seemed logically connected to their core purpose. Modern surveillance advocates genuinely believe broader authorities serve security. Each expansion addresses a real gap they've identified. The psychology isn't cynical. These people care about their missions. That caring drives them to seek more tools, broader authorities, fewer constraints. They're not power-hungry tyrants. They're dedicated professionals who believe in their work and want to do it effectively. That's precisely what makes the pattern so persistent. The uncomfortable reality is that secret law systems emerge from ordinary psychology, not extraordinary malice. They're built by people responding to genuine perceived needs in ways that accumulate into oppressive systems. Understanding this changes the problem. If secret law required evil people, preventing it would mean selecting virtuous leaders. But if secret law emerges from ordinary human psychology, operating without structural constraints, preventing it requires different solutions. Not better people, better systems, not virtuous leadership, institutional safeguards that resist normal psychological pressures towards secrecy. The cognitive dissonance is hardest for those inside systems. Professionals who have built careers in legal or security fields face psychological difficulty, acknowledging their practices contribute to unjust systems. Accepting this requires confronting uncomfortable questions about one's own choices and compromises. It's easier to maintain the protection narrative, to believe complexity justifies opacity, to see one's own secrecy as necessary exception rather than systemic pattern. Breaking the cycle requires recognizing these psychological patterns in others and in ourselves. For nearly 300 years, medieval Iceland operated with no secret laws, no professional lawyers, and no enforcement bureaucracy. Their legal system was memorized and publicly recited. It was remarkably transparent. It was also remarkably violent and ineffective. Transparency alone isn't enough, but its absence is deadly. The Icelandic example matters because it proves transparent law is possible. The medieval Althing system maintained accessible law through oral tradition. Legal codes were memorized by law speakers who recited them publicly at annual assemblies. Everyone could hear the laws governing them. No manuscripts to restrict access, no scribal class controlling knowledge. Legal transparency was built into the system's structure, but the same system struggled to enforce judgments. Transparency didn't guarantee justice, it guaranteed that injustice happened in full view. The system was better than secret law, but it wasn't good. Other examples offer different lessons. Swiss cantonal systems maintained transparency through direct democracy and minimalist law. Citizens participated directly in lawmaking, which inherently limited secret legislation. You can't easily hide laws that citizens themselves are voting on. The scale was small enough that comprehensive public knowledge remained feasible. The early modern Dutch republics emphasized commercial law transparency as a competitive advantage. Merchants needed reliable, knowable rules. Legal predictability attracted trade. The Dutch discovered that transparent law was good business, creating economic incentives for legal accessibility that reinforced political commitments to openness. Contemporary examples exist too. New Zealand has legislative clarity requirements mandating laws be comprehensible to affected populations. Estonia built digital government on transparency principles, making rule modification traceable and accessible. These aren't perfect systems, but they demonstrate that modern states can prioritize transparency more than most currently do. Common factors emerge from successful cases. Smaller scale helps. Comprehensive public knowledge is more feasible in communities where legal volume can be limited. Strong cultural values matter. Societies that prioritize legal accessibility actively resist opacity in ways others don't. Institutional structures make a difference. Systems that make secrecy costly or difficult prevent opacity even when authorities would prefer it. And sometimes competitive pressure helps. Transparency provides advantages over opaque rivals in commercial or political competition. But limitations exist too. Most transparent systems operated in specific domains or at limited scales. The medieval Icelandic system was transparent but covered relatively simple legal matters in a small, homogeneous population. The Swiss cantonal system worked at local levels, but national governance required different approaches. The Dutch commercial transparency didn't extend to all governance domains. This suggests scaling transparency to complex modern nation-states poses genuine challenges beyond just political will. Perhaps some complexity is unavoidable when regulating financial derivatives, environmental systems, or healthcare standards. Perhaps pluralistic societies with competing values require more intricate rules than homogeneous communities. These questions are uncomfortable because they suggest trade-offs without clear answers. The Icelandic system shows that transparency sometimes conflicts with effectiveness. You can have knowable law that fails to prevent violence or enforce justice. Some modern transparent systems operate in societies with high social trust and relatively homogeneous populations. Can their approaches work in diverse, low-trust environments where consensus is harder? Legal scholars debate whether complexity is necessary for justice in pluralistic societies or just rationalization for unnecessary opacity. Both sides present evidence. Complex rules can protect minority rights that simple rules might ignore. But complexity can also hide privileged exceptions that simple rules would expose. The question may not have universal answers. Different societies in different circumstances might face different trade-offs. What's clear from the successful examples is that doing much better than current practice is possible. Societies aren't locked into current levels of legal opacity. Choices were made that created existing systems. Different choices could create different outcomes. Iceland's transparency came with costs, but showed it could be done. Switzerland's direct democracy limited secret law even as scale grew. Estonia proves digital systems can enhance transparency rather than create new forms of opacity. New Zealand demonstrates that clarity requirements can be enforced when political will exists. The question isn't whether perfect transparency is achievable. It probably isn't. The question is whether societies value transparency enough to prioritize it when it conflicts with other goods authorities want. And that question is personal. There's a medieval survival strategy that still works today. Assume you're guilty of something. You just don't know what yet. Then live accordingly. It sounds paranoid. It's actually rational. And that rationality itself is the problem. Navigating opaque legal systems requires practical paranoia, not conspiracy theorizing, but realistic assessment of legal vulnerability and active management of risk. The documentation principle is first. Medieval people who survived secret law regimes often did so through meticulous record-keeping. When arbitrary charges could emerge from hidden rules, documentation provided defense. The principle still applies. In systems with opaque enforcement, document everything. Save receipts. Keep correspondence. Maintain records of compliance attempts. Create paper trails that protect against selective enforcement. A small business owner documents every interaction with regulatory agencies. Years later, she faces an enforcement action claiming she ignored official guidance. Her documentation proves she requested clarification multiple times and received contradictory responses. The case is dismissed. Without documentation, her word against the agencies would have meant losing. The network principle follows. Medieval people survived through information networks that shared knowledge about hidden rules and enforcement patterns. Merchants told each other which laws were actually enforced in which cities. Communities shared information about which officials took bribes and which applied law strictly. Modern equivalents exist. Professional associations share compliance guidance. Online communities document enforcement patterns. Information sharing helps individuals learn rules that aren't easily accessible through official channels. You're targeted for a violation you didn't know existed. Your network warns you that others in your field have faced similar selective enforcement. That the regulation in question is rarely enforced against large competitors. That the agency has a pattern of targeting smaller operators. This information doesn't make the enforcement go away, but it helps you understand what you're facing and how to respond. The visibility calculation matters. In selectively enforced systems, visibility is risk. Being noticed means being vulnerable. This creates perverse incentives. Success makes you a target. You've grown large enough to attract attention. Advocacy makes you vulnerable. You've identified yourself as someone who challenges authority. The safest strategy is often remaining invisible, keeping your head down, avoiding situations that attract scrutiny. This perpetuates injustice. The system relies on most people accepting opacity rather than challenging it. Practical paranoia protects individuals but accommodates rather than resists the system. Yet individual survival is legitimate. You can't fault people for protecting themselves and their families, even when that protection means accepting injustice. The professional intermediary strategy has medieval roots and modern parallels. Medieval people who could afford legal representation were better protected against secret law. Modern equivalents include lawyers, accountants, and compliance professionals who navigate complex systems on behalf of clients. They know the hidden rules, the enforcement patterns, the informal practices that determine outcomes. This creates justice tiers. Those who can afford professional navigation have drastically different legal experiences than those who cannot. The corporation with a compliance department faces different practical law than the individual trying to understand regulations alone. The wealthy person with a lawyer on retainer navigates legal complexity the poor person cannot access. The tension between individual protection and collective resistance is real. Practical paranoia helps individuals survive, but may perpetuate systems by teaching accommodation rather than resistance. Yet some people successfully balance self-protection with advocacy. They challenge opaque systems while managing personal risk. They document problematic practices while protecting themselves legally. They build networks that share information while maintaining strategic visibility. The psychological toll deserves acknowledgement. Living with practical paranoia means ambient anxiety, constant calculation, perpetual uncertainty about compliance, erosion of trust in institutions that should be trustworthy. These costs are distributed unequally. Those with professional guidance and resources experience less anxiety. Those without bear greater psychological burden. Medieval peasants live with this same ambient uncertainty. Modern citizens living in the shadow of legal opacity experience similar effects. The specific rules differ. The psychological experience is remarkably similar. And recognizing that similarity should disturb us. We built systems that were supposed to be better. In some ways they are. But the fundamental dynamics persist. Individual survival matters. But survival alone doesn't change systems. In 2016, a librarian in Oregon filed a single Freedom of Information request. That request eventually revealed a secret government program affecting millions of people. She had no special expertise. She just asked the right question. Your question might be next. Transparency citizenship is a learnable skill. Small numbers of skilled advocates can have disproportionate impact. Here's how. Freedom of information requests are the first tool. Most jurisdictions have laws requiring government disclosure of non-classified documents. These laws are underused. Agencies often don't volunteer information, but they must respond to requests. Ordinary citizens have revealed significant hidden information through strategic FOIA requests. Guidance documents that determine enforcement. Internal memos explaining agency interpretations. Records of selective enforcement patterns. The information exists. You just have to ask, specifically enough. The key is knowing what to ask for. Request specific documents rather than general information. Ask for enforcement statistics by category. Request internal guidance given to field agents. Ask for correspondence between agencies about rule interpretation. Each successful request makes information public that benefits everyone, not just you. Administrative comment processes offer another opening. When agencies create regulations, they typically allow public comment. Most citizens ignore these processes. Small numbers of commenters often shape regulations affecting millions. Your comment forces agencies to respond publicly, to explain and justify choices they'd prefer to make quietly. A concerned citizen comments on a proposed environmental regulation, pointing out that the enforcement mechanism described in the rule contradicts the statute's plain language. The agency must respond. Sometimes they adjust the rule. Sometimes they provide explanation that reveals problematic reasoning. Either way, the exchange is public record. You've forced transparency where there would have been opacity. Documentation and responsible information sharing matter when you encounter hidden or selectively enforced rules. If you discover problematic practices, document them carefully. If you choose to share that information, do so responsibly, protecting sources, verifying facts, considering consequences. Successful whistleblowing requires both courage and strategic thinking. Not everyone can or should take these risks, but those who can have created significant transparency victories. Supporting transparency organizations multiplies your impact. Groups like publicresource.org, the Free Law Project, and domain-specific transparency advocates do systematic work that individual actions can't achieve. Financial support helps. Volunteering helps. Signal boosting helps. These organizations operate on small budgets and depend on citizen support. Electoral accountability connects transparency to political power. Evaluate candidates based on transparency commitments and records. Make transparency a voting issue. Politicians respond to voter priorities. If transparency becomes a criterion for electoral success, political incentives shift. This works at local levels, where individual voters have more impact than in national elections. Realistic expectations matter. Individual actions rarely create immediate dramatic change. Transparency advocacy builds over time through accumulated small actions. The librarian's FOIA request mattered, but only because it built on decades of transparency advocacy that created the legal framework she used. Your contribution joins a longer movement. Common discouragements deserve addressing. Systems feel too big to change. Your individual action seems meaningless. Expertise seems required. These feelings are understandable, but not accurate. Systems change through accumulated individual actions. Expertise can be developed. Ordinary people have created significant transparency victories through persistent strategic engagement. Coalition building amplifies impact. Transparency advocacy crosses typical political divides. Conservatives distrust government secrecy. Liberals value open government. Libertarians oppose hidden authority. Progressives want accountability. This creates opportunities for diverse coalitions rather than partisan movements. Effective transparency advocacy builds these coalitions deliberately. The skill develops with practice. You start by filing one FOIA request. You learn the process. You file better requests. You participate in one comment process. You learn what agencies respond to. You get better at effective participation. Like any skill, transparency citizenship improves with practice. Small numbers matter. If 1% of citizens became skilled transparency advocates, the cumulative impact would transform governance. You don't need mass movements. You need enough people doing consistent strategic transparency work. That number is achievable. The question is whether you're one of them. Not everyone can be, but more people can than currently are. And if this history has taught you anything, it should be that transparency doesn't happen automatically. It requires people who care enough to do the work. You were taught to obey the law. But what if the law you're expected to obey can't actually be known? What do we owe to rules that hide themselves? Medieval peasants faced this question. We're facing it again, and the answer might not be obedience. Traditional legal philosophy grounds obligation in consent. Law's legitimacy derives from the consent of the governed. But you can't meaningfully consent to rules you don't know exist. Secret law undermines the theoretical foundation of legal obligation. If the social contract requires knowing the terms, then unknowable terms aren't part of valid contracts. The publicity principle goes further. Many philosophers argue that law must be public to be legitimate, not just published in technical registries, but genuinely accessible. On this view, secret law isn't merely bad law, it's not normatively law at all. It's arbitrary force dressed in legal language. This has radical implications. If secret law isn't truly law, what's our obligation toward it? If violating an unknowable rule isn't genuine law-breaking, is it wrongdoing? The question unsettles assumptions about legal authority. The civil disobedience tradition assumes unjust but known laws. You understand the law, judge it unjust, and deliberately violate it, accepting consequences. But secret law creates different dynamics. You're punished for violating rules you couldn't know. The justification for civil disobedience, accepting known consequences for principled violation, doesn't apply when the rules themselves are hidden. This might expand the scope of justified resistance. If law is selectively enforced or functionally hidden, does that justify different relationship to legal authority? Historical examples suggest yes. Medieval communities that resisted secret laws weren't simply lawless. They were asserting that hidden law lacked legitimacy. Modern resistance to opaque enforcement follows similar logic. The complexity problem intensifies these questions. If law is so complex that comprehensive compliance is impossible, what's our obligation? Legal scholars increasingly discuss legal impossibility. It's literally impossible to know and comply with all applicable laws. Average citizens unknowingly violate multiple laws regularly. Perfect legal obedience is impossible. This fundamentally changes our relationship to law. If everyone is guilty of something, legal authority becomes selective weapon rather than neutral standard. Obligation can't mean perfect compliance. That's impossible. It must mean something else. But what? One answer is skeptical engagement. Rather than presuming legal authority deserves obedience, citizens should actively evaluate law's legitimacy. Transparent, comprehensible law commands moral authority. Opaque, complex, selectively enforced law commands only pragmatic compliance. You obey to avoid consequences, not because the rules deserve respect. This shift from presumptive obedience to earned legitimacies could change society. Citizens become active evaluators rather than passive subjects. Transparency becomes fundamental criterion for legitimate authority. Law isn't something handed down from expert authorities to be simply obeyed. It's something citizens know, understand, and actively participate in. Risks exist. Undermining legal authority can lead to chaos. Selective skepticism enables bad actors. Complexity sometimes serves genuine needs. The balance between necessary order and appropriate skepticism is difficult. But the alternative, maintaining obedience ideology in systems with significant opacity, perpetuates injustice. Teaching citizens they must obey laws they cannot know creates vulnerability to arbitrary power. Maintaining fiction of legitimate authority for illegitimate systems prevents reform. Medieval legal consciousness was more engaged than modern passive obedience. People knew law through direct participation. They weren't legal experts, but law wasn't expert domain. It was community knowledge. The shift to complex expert-managed law brought benefits, but it also created the opacity problem we're grappling with. Perhaps we need new legal consciousness that combines modern sophistication with pre-modern engagement. Citizens who understand that transparency is legitimacy criterion, who actively evaluate rather than passively obey, who recognize that what we owe to law depends on whether law honors its side of the social contract by remaining knowable. The deepest lesson from secret law's history might be this: hidden law isn't just bad governance, it's invalid governance. Across 2,000 years of human history, in every continent, under every form of government, rulers have discovered the same secret. The best way to control people isn't making them obey rules they hate. It's making them unsure what the rules are. This pattern has a name. It's called power. Secret law isn't an aberration. It's not corruption of justice systems. It's power's preferred tool across cultures and centuries because it uniquely combines effectiveness with legitimacy. Force creates martyrs. Visible oppression can be rallied against. When authority openly beats people for known actions, resistance has a clear target. But secrecy creates confusion, self-censorship, invisible constraint. People police themselves because they don't know where the boundaries are. This is more powerful than violence because it's internalized control. The pattern repeats everywhere you look. Ancient Roman emperors issued rescripts, private legal responses to specific inquiries that became binding precedents. Technically public once issued, but functionally inaccessible because they were scattered across individual cases. The system created law through opacity, giving emperors enormous practical authority while maintaining legal formality. Chinese imperial examination systems deliberately kept full criteria obscure. Advancement required demonstrating mastery, but complete mastery was impossible because the standards weren't fully knowable. This controlled social mobility through opacity. The best candidates were those who intuitively grasped hidden expectations. Essentially, those already socialized into elite culture. The system maintained hierarchy through strategic ambiguity. Colonial legal systems imposed European law while keeping it inaccessible to colonized populations. Laws existed in languages colonized people couldn't read, in books they couldn't access, interpreted by courts they couldn't understand. This created legal control without legal legitimacy. People were punished for violating rules they had no practical way to learn. The system was designed to function this way. The medieval period wasn't unique. It was typical. What's unusual is genuine legal transparency, which requires specific conditions and constant defense. Every major power structure has used legal opacity when possible, resorting to open violence only when secrecy fails. This reveals something fundamental about power. Transparency runs counter to the interests of those who hold authority because information control provides such significant advantages. Even democratic systems with transparency ideals constantly generate new forms of opacity. This creates perpetual tension. Societies must constantly fight for transparency because power constantly recreates secrecy. It's not a battle you win once. It's a practice you maintain. The question is whether this pattern is inevitable or changeable. Can we create structures that make transparency self-sustaining? Or will every generation need to fight this battle anew? Determinists argue the pattern is inherent to power relations. Those who hold power will always seek information asymmetry because it's too valuable to resist. Transparency requires constant pressure from those without power, pushing against natural tendencies towards secrecy. Remove that pressure and opacity returns. Optimists believe institutional design can break the cycle. Constitutional requirements, structural safeguards, technological solutions, these might make transparency self-sustaining. Build the right system, and it maintains itself without requiring heroic citizen vigilance. The historical evidence supports the determinists. Every transparency victory requires ongoing maintenance. Every constitutional safeguard requires people willing to enforce it. Every technological solution for transparency creates new technological possibilities for opacity. Institutions don't maintain themselves. People maintain institutions. Technology alternately helps and hinders. The printing press broke manuscript monopolies, but created new information hierarchies. Digital systems can enhance transparency or create algorithmic opacity. Blockchain makes changes traceable, but can also make systems incomprehensibly complex. Each technological shift changes the form of the struggle, but doesn't eliminate it. The pattern persists because it works. Secret law gives authorities control, while maintaining the appearance of legitimacy. People can be punished while believing they live in just systems. Opposition can be suppressed while maintaining democratic rhetoric. The tool is too effective to abandon. This is uncomfortable knowledge. It suggests the transparency we enjoy is fragile, that opacity is always waiting to return, that the fight never truly ends. But uncomfortable knowledge is still knowledge, and knowledge changes the game. If secret law is power's eternal tool, then recognizing the pattern is resistance. Understanding how it works exposes the mechanism. Teaching others to see it spreads immunity. The pattern persists, but awareness of the pattern is power too. The most dangerous moment for a secret law system isn't when someone breaks it. It's when everyone realizes it exists. Medieval authorities understood this. Modern authorities understand it too. That's why making you aware of the pattern is itself an act of resistance. Awareness changes everything even before concrete change occurs. Medieval people who discovered they were governed by hidden laws experienced radical consciousness shifts. Their world looked different. Authority that seemed legitimate became questionable. Punishments that seemed just became suspicious. The social order that appeared natural revealed itself as constructed and maintained through deliberate opacity. This awareness changed behavior before any laws changed. The end of false consciousness provides protection. Believing you live in a just, transparent system when you actually live in an opaque one creates particular vulnerability. You trust authority that shouldn't be trusted. You assume legality means justice. You internalize control that should be resisted. Recognition, even without immediate remedy, provides protection through realistic assessment. This changes how you navigate systems. You document interactions you'd previously treated casually. You question authority you'd previously accepted. You seek information you'd previously assumed was accessible. The system hasn't changed, but your relationship to it has. That relationship change is real power. Awareness triggers legitimacy crises. Power systems depend partly on belief in their legitimacy. When secrecy is exposed, that belief erodes. The system may continue functioning, but it functions without consent, without moral authority, without the psychological compliance that makes control easy. This erosion matters even when suppression follows exposure. Late medieval exposure of secret laws didn't immediately end them. Authorities initially doubled down, executing printers and banning publications. But legitimacy had been damaged. The system continued through force rather than consent. That shift made it brittle. Eventually, the legitimacy crisis forced reform because authority without legitimacy is expensive to maintain. Awareness enables solidarity. Isolated individuals experiencing opacity feel alone, uncertain whether their experience is unique or systematic. When they discover others face the same hidden rules, isolation becomes community. Shared recognition becomes organizing principle. Transparency movements build from this solidarity. The transmission effect matters most. Once you see secret law patterns, you can teach others to see them. This creates cascading awareness that's difficult to suppress. Medieval literacy spread awareness of hidden laws faster than authorities could contain it. Each person who learned to read could discover secret laws and share that discovery. The information cascade eventually made manuscript-based secrecy unsustainable. Modern digital communication accelerates this. Awareness spreads faster than authorities can suppress it. One person's discovery becomes thousands of people's knowledge within hours. The transparency movements we examined in Chapter 7 depend on this transmission effect. Each victory teaches methods that others can replicate. But there's a counter-argument worth acknowledging. Sometimes ignorance is protective. Awareness without capacity for change creates suffering. Knowing you're governed by hidden laws but lacking power to change, that creates psychological burden without benefit. For individuals, strategic ignorance might be adaptive. Yet for societies overall, widespread awareness is necessary for change. The temporary pain of recognition enables long-term reform. Individual protective ignorance perpetuates collective vulnerability. This creates moral complexity. What benefits individuals may harm society. What helps society may burden individuals. Interestingly, sometimes authorities themselves practice strategic ignorance. They deliberately don't catalogue their complete legal systems because even they prefer not to know the full scope of complexity. Several modern legal reforms began when governments tried to compile comprehensive legal inventories and discovered unsustainable opacity even they couldn't navigate. This suggests awareness threatens power even when power holds awareness. Simply knowing the full extent of legal complexity can create pressure for simplification that authorities would rather avoid. Ignorance protects power. Awareness threatens it, even when authority itself holds that awareness. The essential insight is that awareness is necessary for change, though not sufficient. Every transparency victory in history began with recognition. People had to see they were governed by hidden laws before they could demand visible ones. Printing technology mattered, but only because people recognized the problem it could solve. You now have this recognition. You see the pattern. You understand how secret law functions across history. You recognize parallels in your own systems. This knowledge can't be unknown. It changes how you see authority, law, and power. What you do with that knowledge is your choice. But the choice itself is different now. You're no longer operating in unconscious ignorance. You're making conscious decisions about engagement with systems you now understand. That's the power of knowing. You don't know. Medieval scribes risked death to copy forbidden laws. Enlightenment activists risked imprisonment to demand published legal codes. Digital activists risk prosecution to make law accessible today. The names change. The risk changes. But the fight never ends, because power never stops trying to hide its rules. And now you know why. Now you're one of us. Now you can't look away. Transparency is not a state to be achieved, but a practice requiring eternal vigilance. There will never be a final victory over legal opacity. The pattern we've traced through history shows each generation must fight for transparency anew, because power constantly recreates secrecy in new forms. This isn't pessimism. It's realism about how power operates. We inherit both victories and ongoing struggles. Previous generations won transparency battles that we now benefit from. We can read published statutes because reformers fought for legal publication. We can access court records because activists demanded open courts. We have freedom of information laws because movements made transparency a political priority. These victories weren't inevitable. They were fought for, often at significant personal cost. We owe it to those who came before to maintain what they won. We owe it to those who come after to continue the fight. This is inheritance in both directions, receiving and passing on. Personal responsibility follows. Legal transparency isn't just government responsibility or activist responsibility. It's every citizen's responsibility. Functioning democracy requires legally informed citizens. Informed citizens require accessible law. Accessible law requires constant citizen pressure. The chain breaks without ordinary people doing ordinary transparency work. Professionals carry special obligations. Lawyers, judges, legislators, and bureaucrats can be either enablers of secret law or defenders of transparency. Every time a professional chooses clarity over obfuscation, accessibility over restriction, simplicity over unnecessary complexity, they defend transparency. Every time they choose otherwise, they enable opacity. These choices accumulate into systemic outcomes. The educational imperative matters deeply. Teaching people to recognize legal opacity patterns is essential. Legal education should include transparency consciousness. General education should teach citizens to question legal authority rather than reflexively obey it. The next generation's relationship to law depends on what we teach them about legitimate authority. Here's a framework for ongoing vigilance. Ask questions. What laws govern this situation? Don't assume you know. Actively seek information. Demand access. Show me the rule. Make authority cite specific legal bases. Create the friction that makes hidden law costly. Document everything. Create accountability through records. Make opacity traceable and challengeable. Share knowledge. Break information monopolies. What you discover should benefit others. Support transparency. Make it a priority in voting, advocacy, and daily choices. These 5 practices, applied consistently by enough people, maintain pressure that prevents secret law systems from fully forming. They won't eliminate opacity entirely. That's probably impossible. But they make opacity more difficult, more costly, more visible. That's realistic victory. The work can feel endless and discouraging. Recognizing that the fight never truly ends can create burnout and despair. But reframe it. Transparency. Vigilance isn't a burden. It's a practice of citizenship, no different from voting or staying informed. It's simply what maintaining free societies requires. The alternative is accepting secret law as natural and inevitable, which means accepting that power should operate in darkness. This connects to broader democratic practices. Transparency vigilance is part of the larger work of maintaining self-governance against the eternal tendency toward concentrated power. Power concentrates. Authority seeks secrecy. These are constants. Democratic practice means resisting these constants, not achieving permanent victory over them. Medieval people who died fighting secret laws didn't fail because secret laws still exist. They succeeded because their resistance made the system more transparent than it would have been, and because they passed on the practice of resistance itself. Every increment of transparency we enjoy was fought for by someone. Every increment we maintain or expand will benefit someone who comes after. The work is endless, but it's also noble, necessary, and effective when sustained across generations. You now know something most people don't know. Secret law is a pattern, not an accident. It persists across history. It exists in your own society in various forms. What you do with that knowledge is up to you, but you can't unknow it. You're now part of the informed minority. Welcome to the vigilance. The laws are still hidden. The fight continues. Now you know.